Section 21 of the Science History of the Universe, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by THBosc. The Science History of the Universe, Volume 5. Edited by Francis Rolt-Wheeler. Biology. Chapter 12. Factors of Evolution Selection, Part 3. Although natural selection can act only through and for the good of each being, yet characters and structures, which are apt to consider as of very trifling importance, may thus be acted on. When we see leaf-eating insects green, and bark-feeders mottled gray, the alpine ptarmigan white in winter, the red grouse the color of heather, we must believe that these tints are of service to these birds and insects in preserving them from danger. Grouse, if not destroyed at some period of their lives, would increase in countless numbers. They are known to suffer largely from birds of prey, and hawks are guided by eyesight to their prey, so much so that on parts of the continent persons are warned not to keep white pigeons, as being the most liable to destruction. Hence, natural selection might be effective in giving the proper color to each kind of grouse, and in keeping that color, when once acquired, true and constant. Nor ought we to think that the occasional destruction of an animal of any particular color would produce little effect. We should remember how essential it is in a flock of white sheep to destroy a lamb with the faintest trace of black. In looking at many small points of difference between species, which, as far as our ignorance permits us to judge, seem quite unimportant, we must not forget that climate, food, etc., have no doubt produced some direct effect. It is also necessary to bear in mind that owing to the law of correlation, when one part varies and the variations are accumulated through natural selection, other modifications, often of the most unexpected nature, will ensue. As we see that those variations, which under domestication appear at any particular period of life, tend to reappear in the offspring at the same period, for instance, in the shape, size, and flavor of the seeds of the many varieties of our culinary and agricultural plants, in the caterpillar and cocoon stages of the varieties of the silkworm, in the eggs of poultry and in the color of the down of their chickens, in the horns of our sheep and cattle when nearly adult. So in a state of nature natural selection will be enabled to act on and modify organic beings at any age by the accumulation of variations profitable at that age, and by their inheritance at a corresponding age. If it profit a plant to have its seeds more and more widely disseminated by the wind, I can see no greater difficulty in this being effected through natural selection than in the cotton planter increasing and improving by selection the down in the pods on his cotton trees. Natural selection may modify and adapt the larva of an insect to a score of contingencies which wholly different from those which concern the mature insect, and these modifications may affect, through correlation, the structure of the adult. So, conversely, modifications in the adult may affect the structure of the larva, but in all cases natural selection will ensure that they shall not be injurious, for if they were so, the species would become extinct. Natural selection will modify the structure of the young in relation to the parent, and of the parent in relation to the young. In social animals, it will adapt the structure of each individual for the benefit of the whole community, if the community profits by the selected change. What natural selection cannot do is to modify the structure of one species without giving it any advantage for the good of another species, and though statements to this effect may be found in works of natural history, I cannot find one case which will bear investigation. A structure used only once in an animal's life, if of high importance to it, might be modified to any extent by natural selection. For instance, the great jaws possessed by certain insects, used exclusively for opening the cocoon, or the hard tip to the beak of unhatched birds, used for breaking the egg. It may be well here to remark that with all beings there must be much fortuitous destruction, which can have little or no influence on the course of natural selection. For instance, a vast number of eggs or seeds are annually devoured, and these could be modified through natural selection only if they varied in some manner which protected them from their enemies. Yet many of these eggs or seeds would, perhaps, if not destroyed, have yielded individuals better adapted to their conditions of life than any of those which happened to survive. So again, a vast number of mature animals and plants, whether or not they be the best adapted to their conditions, must be annually destroyed by accidental causes, which would not be in the least degree mitigated by certain changes of structure or constitution which would in other ways be beneficial to the species. But let the destruction of the adults be ever so heavy, if the number which can exist in any direction be not wholly kept down by such causes, or again, let the destruction of eggs or seeds be so great that only 100th or 1,000th part are developed, yet of those which do survive, the best adapted individuals, supposing that there is any variability in a favorable direction, will tend to propagate their kind in larger numbers than the less well adapted. If the numbers be wholly kept down by the causes just indicated, as will often have been the case, natural selection will be powerless in certain beneficial directions. But this is no valid objection to its efficiency at other times and in other ways, for we are far from having any reason to suppose that many species ever undergo modification and improvement at the same time in the same area. In concluding this sketch of Darwin's natural selection theory, it should be noted that Darwin believed natural selection to be the most important, but not the sole, factor in producing new forms of organisms. His later followers, especially of the Weismann school, have held natural selection to be the all-sufficient factor of evolution. It will be necessary to return to this in discussing modern criticisms of Darwinism. Summarizing the essential points in the natural selection theory, Jordan and Kellogg say that, of all the various factors of organic evolution, the one which has been most relied on as the great determining agent is that called natural selection, the survival of the individuals best fitted for the conditions of life, with the inheritance of those species forming adaptations in which fitness lies. The primal initiative is not in natural selection, but in variation, germinal and individual. This may be slight variation, fluctuation, or large deviation, saltation, but in any case, all difference in species or race must first be individual. The impulse to change, once arisen, is continued through heredity. From natural selection arises the choice among different lines of descent, the adaptive tending to exclude the non-adaptive, while traits which are neither helpful nor hurtful, but simply indifferent, may be borne along by the current of adaptive characters. Finally, separation or isolation tends to preserve a special line of heredity from being merged in the mass which constitutes the parent stock or species. Without individual variation, no change could take place. All organisms would be identical in structure. Although the Darwinian theory has been subject to no popularly recognized attack during the last quarter of a century, nevertheless there has been accumulating a massive criticism of it. Only a sketch of some of the leading criticisms can be presented. These will be taken in large measure from Kellogg's Darwinism Today. Among the critics of the selection theories, he says, we must note two groups, differing in the character of their criticism more in degree than in kind, perhaps, but still importantly differing. One group denies in toto any effectiveness or capacity for species forming on the part of natural selection, while the other group, a larger one, sees in natural selection an effective factor in directing or controlling the general course of descent, holding it to adaptive lines, but denies it outright any such Allmacht of species control as the more eager selectionists, the so-called Neo-Darwinians or Weismannians, credit it with. This larger group of critics sees in natural selection an evolutionary factor capable of initiating nothing, dependent wholly for any effectiveness on some primary factor or factors controlling the origin and direction of variation, but wholly capable of extinguishing all unadapted, unfit lines of development, and in this way of exercising decisive, final control over the general course of descent, i.e., organic evolution. The general impression left on one after a considerable course of anti-Darwinian reading is that there is a very real and effective amount of destructive criticism for Darwinians to meet, and at the same time a curious paucity of satisfactory or at all convincing substitutionary theory offered by the anti-Darwinians to replace that which they are attempting to dethrone. The situation illustrates admirably the varying worth of a few facts. A few stubborn facts of the wrong complexion are fatal things for a theory. They are immensely effective offensive weapons. But these same few facts make a pitiable showing when they are called on to support a theory of their own. It was exactly the greatest part of Darwin's greatness, it seems to me, that he launched his theory only after making the most remarkable collection of facts yet gathered together in biological science by any one man. Testing his theory by applying to it successively fact after fact, group after group, and category after category of facts, he convinced himself of the theory's consonance with all this vast array of observed biological actuality. Compare the grounding of any of the now offered replacing theories with the preparation and founding of Darwinism. In 1864, von Kolliker, a great biologist, convinced of the incapacity of natural selection to do the work assigned it by its founders and friends, suggested a theory of the origin of species by considerable leaps. In 1899, Korchinski, on the basis of some few personal observations and the compiling of some others, definitely formulated a theory of species forming by sudden considerable variations, namely mutations. In 1901 and 1903 appeared the 2 volumes of De Vries's Die Mutationstheorie, in which are revealed the results of long years of careful personal observation, in truly Darwinian manner, directed toward the testing and better grounding of this mutations theory of species origin. The results are: out of many plant species studies, a few show at certain times in the course of numerous generations a behavior in accordance with the demands of a theory of species forming by sudden definitive modification, that is, species forming by mutations. The mutations theory, thus launched, is offered as a substitute for the natural selection theory obviously weakening under the fire of modern scientific criticism. But however effective De Vries's facts are in proving the possibility of the occurrence of other variations than those fortuitous ones occurring in continuous series from mean to opposite extremes, which Darwin recognized as the basis of species forming, and however effective they are in proving the actual production of 3 or 6 or 10 species by mutation, and however effective in both these capacities they are as weapons of attack on the dominance of the Darwinian theory of species making, how really inadequate are they to serve as the basis of a great all-answering theory, explaining in a causo-mechanical way the facts of descent, or even the primary facts of general species forming. The natural selection theory, as an all-sufficient explanation of adaptation and species forming, has always had a weakness at its base. It depends absolutely, of course, on the pre-existence of variations, but it itself has no influence whatever on the origin or control of these variations to give birth to other individuals. Now, one of the chief problems in biology is exactly that of the origin, the causes, and the primary control of these congenital variations. 3 principal explanations, no one of them experimentally proved or even fairly tested as yet, have been given of this actually occurring congenital variation, viz. 1. That there exists in the germ plasm an inherent tendency or capacity to vary so that there is inevitable variation in all individuals produced from germ plasm. This variation being wholly fortuitous and fluctuating according to some, the belief of Darwin and his followers, or according to others, this variation following certain fixed or determinate lines, determinate variation, orthogenetic variation, etc. 2. That amphimixis, i.e., biparental parentage, is the principal cause of variation, it seeming logical to presume that individuals produced from germ cells derived from the fusion of germ plasm coming from 2 individuals more or less unlike would differ slightly from either of the parental individuals. And 3. that congenital variation is due to the influence of the ever-varying environment of the germ cell producing individuals. The objections to any one of these theories may be very pertinent, as when one says regarding the first that calling a thing inherent is not clearing up in any degree a phenomenon for which we are demanding a causo-mechanical explanation, or of the second that it has been proved that individuals produced parthenogenetically, that is, from an unmated mother, vary, and in some cases vary even more than do other individuals of the same species produced by amphimixis, or of the third, that as far as our study of the actual processes and mechanism of the production of germ cells and of embryos has gone, we have found no apparent means whereby this influence of the ambient medium can be successfully impressed on the germ plasm. But however pertinent the objections to the why of variation may be, they do not in any way invalidate the fact that variations do continuously and inevitably occur in all individuals, and that while many of these variations are recognizably such as have been impressed on the individual during its personal development as immediate results of varying temperature, amount or kind of food, degree of humidity, etc., to which it may be exposed in its young life, others seem wholly inexplicable on a basis of varying individual environment, and are certainly due to some antenatal influence acting on the germ plasm from which the embryo is derived. Now, the natural selection theory, in its Darwinian and neo-Darwinian form, presupposes fortuitously occurring congenital variations of practically infinite variety in all parts of all organisms. Actual observation shows that all parts of all organisms do vary, and that they vary congenitally, that is, independently of any immediate influence during development exercised from without by environmental conditions, as well as in response to these environmental influences, and finally, that in many cases this variation is fortuitous, that is, that it occurs according to the laws of chance. The industrious statistical study of variations, including the tabulation of the variation condition in long series of individuals of the same species or race, and the mathematical formulation of this variation condition, have shown that in many specific cases, studied in numerous kinds of animal and plant forms, the character of the variation in any particular character may be truly represented, with close approximation, by the mathematical expression and curve which would exactly define the condition in which the variation would exist if it actually followed the law of error. It is these continuous series of slight variations, these variously called fluctuating, individual, or Darwinian variations, occurring in all organisms at all times, and often following in their occurrence the laws of chance, on which Darwin's theory of species forming by natural selection is based. But this same industrious statistical and quantitative study of variation, which has proved that some variations do occur regularly, fluctuating around a mean or mode, has shown as well that in many cases the variations distinctly tend to heap up on one side or the other of the mean, that is, that they tend to occur along certain lines or toward certain directions rather than uniformly out in all directions. Also it is true, and this has, of course, been long known, that by no means all variations are so slight nor in such perfectly gradatory or continuous series as is true of the gradatory Darwinian variations. Sports have been known to breeders of plants and animals ever since plant and animal breeding began. Bateson has filled a large book with records of discontinuous variations in animals, variations, that is, of large size and not occurring as members of continuous gradatory series, so that biologists are acquainted with many cases of variation that seem to be of a kind, or to exhibit a tendency to institute special directions of development, and thus not to be of the simple, non-initiating, inert character of the fortuitous, slight, fluctuating variations, among which natural selection is presumed to choose those that are to become the beginnings of new lines of modification and descent. Many biologists believe firmly that variations occur in many special cases, if not in most cases, only along certain special lines. Paleontologists believe, practically as a united body, that variation has followed fixed lines through the ages, and there has been no such unrestricted and utterly free play of variational vagary as the Darwinian natural selection theory presupposes. Now it is at least obvious that natural selection is absolutely limited in its work to the material furnished by variation, so that if variation occurs in any cases along certain determinate lines, selection can do no more than make use of these lines. Indeed, if variation can occur persistently along determinate lines, natural selection's function in controlling evolution in such cases is limited to the police power of restricting or inhibiting further development along any one or more of these lines which are of a disadvantageous character, that is, a character which handicaps or destroys the efficiency of its members in the struggle for life. The question in many men's mouths today is, why may not variation be the actual determinant factor in species forming, in descent? It actually is, respond many biologists and paleontologists. Even Darwin believed such determinate variation to occur, as is indicated by repeated statements in The Origin of Species. This problem of the existence or non-existence of determinate variations is one of the most important matters in connection with the whole great problem of descent, that is, of evolution. It is the basic problem of evolution, for it is the problem of beginnings. Selection, isolation, and the like factors are conditions of species forming. Variation is a prerequisite. True variation must have its causes, and these causes are to be determined before an actual causo-mechanical explanation of evolution can ever be found. But the determination of the relation of variation to species forming is certainly the first step now necessary in our search for the basic factors, the real first cause of species change. Space will not permit analysis of the general lines of objections raised in the foregoing. These objections have led many biologists to the totally anti-Darwinian position that the struggle for existence and the corresponding selection of the fit are not factors of evolution. But perhaps the majority of biologists who recognize the objections cited are inclined to believe in natural selection as the great conserving factor of evolution, while allowing that it does not create new forms. To quote from T.H. Morgan, "The theory of natural selection has nothing to do with the origin of species, but with the survival of already formed species. Not selection of the fittest individuals, but the survival of the sufficiently fit species." In summarizing the present-day standing of the Darwinian theory, Kellogg says, "I think I speak fairly in saying that the believers and defenders of the natural selection theory today admit in large measure the validity of those criticisms which are directed at the incapacity of Darwinism, in its long familiar form, to account for the development of variations and modifications up to the advantageous or disadvantageous stage. They admit, also, the actual existence, and in abundant measure, of species differences which are of indifferent character, that is, of no special utility, and make the consequent admission that such species differences cannot for the most part be explained by natural selection. And they also concede, or at least most of them, including Weismann, do, the force of the criticism that the assumption of the occurrence of the right variations at the right time is a necessity for the development by selection of many, if not most, specializations of qualitative and of co-adaptive character, which assumption in turn demands an explanation of causes anterior to selection. And finally, most selectionists concede that selection cannot make new species by relying on the extremes of series of fluctuating or Darwinian variations, because of the inevitable extinguishing or swamping of these extreme variations by interbreeding with the far more abundant average or modal individuals of the species. Making such concessions, it is necessary to recognize that there are factors of evolution other than natural selection, and these require separate treatment. End of section 21.
Section 22 of the Science History of the Universe, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Science History of the Universe, Volume 5, edited by Francis Rolt-Wheeler. Biology, Chapter 13, Sexual Selection. In building up the theory of natural selection, Darwin found that while this theory was sufficient to explain the useful in organic structures, it did not sufficiently explain that class of phenomena which go to constitute the beautiful. Darwin therefore suggested an auxiliary theory to give a scientific explanation to these widespread phenomena. To quote Romanes, just as by his theory of natural selection he sought to explain the major fact of utility, so did he endeavor to explain the minor fact of beauty by a theory of what he termed sexual selection. Kellogg's exposition of this theory has been partly followed in the following account. Every zoologist is familiar with the striking differences between the male and female individual of a single species. The reader will recall the feathers of many male birds, which are in striking contrast to the sober plumage of their mates. These differences in size, color, general appearances, and various specific structural details in head, trunk, wings, feet, plumage, etc., are over and beyond those primary radical differences existing in all species in which the two sexes are differentiated. Some of these differences may, however, have obvious relation to the primary differences, in that they may be connected immediately with the act of pairing or with the work of rearing the young. The presence in male insects of complexly developed holding organs, and in female mammals of milk glands, exemplifies differences of this category. A great many sexual differences, however, have no such obvious direct relation to the function of producing and rearing the young. Such are the metallic purple and bronze colors of the male grackles compared with the dull brown of the females, the long tails and brilliant coloration of the male pheasants, the great spreading patterned tail of the peacock, the larger size or the winglessness of many female insects, etc. All these differences between male and female of the same species of animal, beyond or in addition to the differences between the actual primary reproductive organs, are known as secondary sexual differences, or the characters themselves, which may be characteristics of physiology and habit, as well as the more familiar ones of structure, are called secondary sexual characters. The layman may not readily appreciate the abundance and the great variety of these characters, but it is a fact that almost all species of animals, excepting those in the lower invertebrate branches, show them, and if one will try to recall the aspect of the two sexes in one after another of the species of animals with which one is familiar, mammals, birds, insects, etc., one will begin to realize how widespread and significant are these secondary sexual characters. Many of these secondary sexual characters have uses which are of a kind directly helpful in the struggle for existence, as the strong antlers of the stags, useful in defense against attacking enemies, the brood sacs of the kangaroos and opossum, useful in caring for their helpless young, the milk glands and teats of all female mammals, and the protective colors and patterns of many insects and birds. But others of these secondary sexual characters are either of a kind apparently useless in the struggle for life, or even of a kind actually harmful. Of apparent harmfulness are the conspicuous staring colors of many male birds, the long dangling plumes, the weighty crests and heavy dragging tails of others, all these parts also usually being dangerously, conspicuously colored. The lively loud song of many male birds, and the dancing and leaping of numerous male spiders and some male birds, must also involve some danger to the performers by attracting the attention of their enemies. In fact, most of those secondary sexual characters that are classified under the general head of exciting organs are apparently of a sort that should be actually disadvantageous in the struggle for existence. They are of a character tending to make their possessors conspicuous, and thus readily perceived by their carnivorous enemies. How is to be explained the existence of so many and such highly developed structural and physiological characters of this kind, a condition that seems to stand in direct opposition to the theory of natural selection? Darwin's answer to this question is contained in his theory of sexual selection. This theory, in few words, is that there is practically a competition or struggle for mating, and that those males are successful in this struggle which are the strongest and best equipped for battle among themselves, or which are most acceptable by reason of ornament or other attractiveness to the females. In the former case, mating with a certain female depends upon overcoming in fight the other suitors, the female being the passive reward of the victor. In the second case, the female is presumed to exercise a choice, this choice depending upon the attractiveness of the male. The actual fighting among males and the winning of the females by the victor are observed facts in the life of numerous animal species. But a special sexual selection theory is hardly necessary to explain the development of the fighting equipment, antlers, spurs, claws, etc. This fighting array of the male is simply a special phase of the already recognized intraspecific struggle. It is not a fight for room or food, but for the chance to mate. But this chance often depends on the issue of a life and death struggle. Natural selection would thus account for the development of the weapons for this struggle. For the development, however, of such secondary sexual characters as ornament and song, and special odors, and love dancing, the natural selection theory can in no way account. The theory of sexual selection was the logical and necessary auxiliary theory, and when first proposed by Darwin, met with quick and wide acceptance. Wallace, in particular, took up the theory and applied it to explain many cases of remarkable plumage and pattern development among birds. Later, as he analyzed more carefully his cases and those proposed by others, he became doubtful and finally wholly skeptical of the theory. A few extracts from The Origin of Species will present the theory in Darwin's own words. This form of selection, he explains, depends not on a struggle for existence in relation to other organic beings or to external conditions, but on a struggle between the individuals of one sex, generally the males, for the possession of the other sex. The result is not death to the unsuccessful competitor, but few or no offspring. Sexual selection is therefore less rigorous than natural selection. Generally, the most vigorous males, those which are best fitted for their places in nature, will leave most progeny. But in many cases, victory depends not so much on general vigor as on having special weapons confined to the male sex. A hornless stag or spurless cock would have a poor chance of leaving numerous offspring. Sexual selection, by always allowing the victor to breed, might surely give indomitable courage, length to the spur, and strength to strike in the spurred leg, in nearly the same manner as does the brutal cockfighter by the careful selection of his best cocks. Among birds, the contest is often of a peaceful character. All those who have attended to the subject believe that there is the severest rivalry between the males of many species to attract, by singing, the females. The rock thrush of Guyana, birds of paradise, and some others congregate, and successive males display with the most elaborate care and show off in the best manner their gorgeous plumage. They likewise perform strange antics before the females, which, standing by as spectators, at last choose the most attractive partner. If man can in a short time give beauty and an elegant carriage to his bantams, according to his standard of beauty, I can see no good reason to doubt that female birds, by selecting, during thousands of generations, the most melodious or beautiful males according to their standard of beauty, might produce a marked effect. Many difficulties in the way of the application of this theory have been advanced in recent years as a result of experimental work and more widespread observation. Morgan lists 20 such objections. Space will allow mention of only a few of the most important criticisms of the theory. These are outlined by Kellogg essentially as follows. The theory can be applied only to species in which the males are markedly more numerous than the females, or in which the males are polygamous. In other cases there will be a female for each male, whether he be ornamented or not, and the unornamented males can leave as many progeny as the ornamented ones, which would prevent any accumulation of ornamental variations by selection. As a matter of fact, in a majority of animal species, at least among the vertebrates, males and females exist in approximately equal numbers. Observation shows that in most species, the female is wholly passive in the matter of pairing, accepting the first male that offers. Ornamental colors, moreover, as Kellogg points out, are as often a characteristic of males of kinds of animals in which there is no real pairing as among those which pair. How explain by sexual selection the remarkable colors in the breeding season of many fishes, in which the female never perhaps even sees the male which fertilizes her dropped eggs? Choice on a basis of ornament and attractiveness implies a high degree of aesthetic development on the part of the females of animals for whose development in this line we have no other proof. Indeed, this choice demands aesthetic recognition among animals to which we distinctly deny such a development, as the butterflies and other insects in which secondary sexual characters of color, etc., are abundant and conspicuous. Similarly with practically all invertebrate animals. Further, in those groups of higher animals where aesthetic choice may be presumed possible, we have repeated evidence that preferences vary with individuals. Besides, even if we may attribute fairly a certain amount of aesthetic feeling to such animals as mammals and birds, is this feeling to be so keen as to lead the female to make choice among only slightly differing patterns of songs? Yet this assumption is necessary if the development of ornament and other attracting and exciting organs is to be explained by the selection and gradual accumulation through generations of slight fortuitously appearing fluctuating variations in the males. Even if the females do choose among the males on a basis of attractiveness, how are the characters of the more attractive males to become especially fostered and accumulated by selection? Do such males produce more offspring or more vigorous ones than the other males, which though rejected by the first females, find their mates among the females not already mated? Are we to attribute to the more ornamental males a particular vigor? If so, may not that very vigor be the cause of the extra production of color or plumage or wattles, etc.? Darwin admits, in order to explain the beginnings of color and ornament development, a certain degree of difference between the male and female in regard to their reaction to environment influences. If so, may not these admitted differences be really sufficient to account for even a pretty high degree of difference in development of secondary sexual characters? The special display of colors, tufts, plumes, spreading tails, and other secondary sexual characters by the males at mating time is an observed fact. The dances of cranes and storks, the serenades of the songbirds, the evolutions of the male spiders, are all familiar phenomena in the mating season of these animals. And they probably do exercise an exciting effect on the females, and are probably actually displayed for this purpose. But does this in any way prove, or even give basis for, a reasonable presumption for belief in a discriminating and definitive choice among the males on the part of the female? And it is this actual choosing which is the necessary basis for the theory of sexual selection. How explain the well-known cases of a similar extra development of plumage in the nuptial season by both males and females, as in certain herons and other birds? And what of those cases in which it is the female that is the brighter colored individual of the pair? To explain the latter case, Darwin assumes that in these cases the males have done the selecting, but even this rather too easy removal of the situation postulated as a fundamental generalization of the theory does not explain the first of the questions in this paragraph. Do both sexes among the herons do selecting? To the objection that choice on the part of the female assumes her possession of an aesthetic ideal and the power of selection in accordance with that ideal, which is contrary to our knowledge of animal psychology, Lloyd Morgan answers that the choice is not one of deliberation, but rather of impulse. It is simply a definite response to an adequate stimulus. She accepts that mate which by his song or otherwise excites in sufficient degree the pairing impulse. If others fail to excite this impulse, they are not accepted. It is a choice from impulse, not the result of deliberation, but it is a choice which is determined by the emotional meaning of the conscious situation, and it is the reiterated revival of the associated emotional elements which generates an impulse sufficiently strong to overcome her instinctive coyness and reluctance. It is a perceptual choice arising from impulse rather than an ideational choice due to motive and volition. The final line of criticism is that experimental evidence is strongly opposed to the theory of sexual selection. Mayer, director of the Tortugas Laboratory of the Carnegie Institute, has proved by many careful experiments that the striking differences between the wings of male and female Promethea moths, Calosamia promethea, are absolutely without meaning in relation to sexual selection. The animals mate normally when painted, or after the wings have been cut off and others glued on in their place. Mayer tried to test the selective action of the female. The male Promethea has blackish wings, while the females are reddish-brown. In accordance with the theory of sexual selection, the peculiar coloration of the male should be due to the selection of dark-colored males, so that under this influence the males would become, in successive generations, darker until the present coloration has been attained. Mayer's own account of his experiments and conclusions to test the preferences and selective action of the females is as follows. In order to test this hypothesis, I cut off the wings of a number of females, leaving only short stumps, from which all the scales were carefully brushed. Male wings were then neatly glued to the stumps, and thus the female presented the appearance of a male. Under these circumstances, the males mated with the female quite as readily as they would have done under normal conditions. I then tried the experiment of gluing female wings upon the male. Here again the mating seemed to occur with normal frequency, and I was unable to detect that the females displayed any unusual aversion toward their effeminate-looking consorts. It is also interesting to note that normal males pay no attention to males with female wings. In another series of experiments, the wings were cut entirely off of males and females and the scales brushed off their bodies, and yet these shabby males were readily accepted by normal females. Nor could I see that normal males displayed any aversion to mating with wingless females. Mayer's next experiments were directed to the end of determining if the males found the females by sight or by smell. By enclosing females in numerous jars variously arranged and covered or uncovered, it was readily determinable that males never pay any attention to females enclosed in transparent jars so closed as to prevent the escape of any odors from the female, while to females enclosed in boxes or wrapped in cotton so as to be invisible, but yet capable of giving odor off into the air, males came promptly and hovered about. To locate the organs of scent in the female, Mayer cut off abdomens from various females and then placed abdomens and abdomenless females at some little distance apart. Males came to the abdomens and not to the thorax plus wings, legs, and head parts. It was readily proved by experiments with males whose antennae were covered with shellac, photographic paste, etc., that the sense of smell is seated in the antennae. Males with antennae covered with photographic paste did not find females, while the same males with this paste dissolved off did. All this evidence showed quite clearly that it was odor rather than color which served to attract the males to the females. In lizards, too, in which sexual dimorphism is conspicuous, females showed no preference for particular patterns exhibited by the males in breeding coat. Many such experiments with like results seem to make the rejection of Darwin's theory of sexual selection necessary. But if it is rejected, other explanations of the origin of the secondary sexual characters are needed. such theories have been advanced. Kellogg says of them that the theories proposed to account for secondary sexual characters mostly rest on one or both of two principal assumptions. First, that the secondary sexual characters are produced as the result of the immediate stimulus, naturally different, of the sexually differing primary reproductive organs, this stimulus being usually considered to result from an internal secretion of the genital organs acting on certain tissues of the organism. And second, that the males in most species possess an excess of energy, which manifests itself in extra growths, extra development of pigment, plumage, etc., and that displays by the males of special movements, sound making, etc., are direct effects or manifestations of sexual excitation. It thus appears that the sexual selection theory, as a special application of natural selection, is far from being in good standing with present-day biologists. The truth is that most of the work recently done has been destructive, and there is as yet no satisfactory replacing theory. End of section 22. Section 23 of the Science History of the Universe, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Science History of the Universe, Volume 5, edited by Francis Rolt-Wheeler, Biology, Chapter 14. Factors of Evolution Other than Selection. The most important question raised in biological science by Darwin's work is whether natural selection has been the sole or but the main cause of the descent of species or organic evolution. Darwin's own answer to this question was quite distinct. He stoutly resisted, says Romanes, the doctrine that natural selection was to be regarded as the only cause of organic evolution. In many parts of his works, Darwin showed that he believed in the possibility of the inheritance of the effects of the use and disuse of organs, the Lamarckian factor. This view, and also the admission of still other factors, is clearly set forth in the first paragraph of the conclusion to The Origin of Species. It has been said that a more strongly worded passage cannot be found in Darwin's writings, and that the last sentences present the only note of bitterness in all the thousands of pages Darwin wrote. I have now recapitulated, he says, the facts and considerations which have thoroughly convinced me that species have been modified during a long course of descent. This has been effected chiefly through the natural selection of numerous successive, slight, favorable variations, aided in an important manner by the inherited effects of the use and disuse of parts, and in an unimportant manner, that is, in relation to adaptive structures, whether past or present, by the direct action of external conditions, and by variations which seem to us in our ignorance to arise spontaneously. It appears that I formerly underrated the frequency and value of these latter forms of variation, as leading to permanent modifications of structure independently of natural selection. But as my conclusions have lately been much misrepresented, and it has been stated that I attribute the modification of species exclusively to natural selection, I may be permitted to remark that in the first edition of this work and subsequently, I placed in a most conspicuous position, namely at the close of the introduction, the following words: I am convinced that natural selection has been the main, but not the exclusive means of modification. This has been of no avail. Great is the power of steady misrepresentation, but the history of science shows that, fortunately, this power does not long endure. While Darwin thus admitted the possibility of other factors of evolution, Alfred Russel Wallace, the co-originator of the natural selection theory, has believed natural selection to be the all-sufficient factor. Romanes has thus contrasted the views of Darwin and Wallace. According to Darwin, natural selection has been the main means of modification, not excepting the case of man. A. Therefore, it is a question of evidence whether the Lamarckian factors have cooperated. B. Neither all species nor a fortiori all specific characters have been due to natural selection. C. Thus the principle of utility is not of universal application, even where species are concerned. D. Thus also the suggestion as to sexual selection or any other supplementary cause of modification may be entertained. And, as in the case of the Lamarckian factors, it is a question of evidence whether or how far they have cooperated. E. No detriment arises to the theory of natural selection as a theory of the origin of species by entertaining the possibility or the probability of supplementary factors. F. Cross-sterility in species cannot possibly be due to natural selection. According to Wallace, natural selection has been the sole means of modification, excepting in the case of man. A. Therefore, it is antecedently impossible that the Lamarckian factors can have cooperated. B. Not only all species, but all specific characters must necessarily have been due to natural selection. C. Thus the principle of utility must necessarily be of universal application where species are concerned. D. Thus also the suggestion as to sexual selection or of any other supplementary cause of modification must be ruled out, and as in the case of the Lamarckian factors, their cooperation deemed impossible. E. The possibility, and a fortiori the probability, of any supplementary factors cannot be entertained without serious detriment to the theory of natural selection as a theory of the origin of species. F. Cross-sterility in species is probably due to natural selection. This comparison makes it evident that the Darwinism of Darwin is natural selection plus other factors, while the Darwinism of Wallace is natural selection alone as the cause of evolution. In late years, this view of Wallace has been highly developed by Weismann and his followers, who have argued for the all-sufficiency of natural selection and have especially opposed other factors which Darwin admitted might have aided natural selection. This view of Wallace and Weismann should be called Neo-Darwinism or Ultra-Darwinism. In discussing the criticisms of natural selection, it has been shown that there are serious difficulties in the way of universal application of Neo-Darwinism. For this reason, even Weismann has been forced to modify his views. Most prominent of the theories of the factors of evolution which have rivaled natural selection is that put forth before Darwin's work by Lamarck, 1744 to 1829. Lamarck's theory did not attract much attention during his lifetime, but since Darwin's time, Lamarckism has become well known. The Lamarckian theory is commonly referred to as the theory of use and disuse and the direct action of the environment in modifying organs. Moreover, it holds that characteristics acquired during the lifetime of an individual are transmissible by heredity. The Lamarckian view, as given by Osborn, is formulated into four well-known propositions following. 1. Life, by its internal forces, tends continually to increase the volume of every body that possesses it, as well as to increase the size of all the parts of the body up to a limit which it brings about. 2. The production of a new organ or part results from a new need or want, which continues to be felt, and from the new movement which this need initiates and causes to continue. This is the physical factor in his theory, which Cope later has termed archesthetism. 3. The development of organs and their force or power of action are always in direct relation to the employment of these organs. At another point, he expands this into two sub-laws. In every animal which has not passed the term of its development, the more frequent and sustained employment of each organ strengthens little by little this organ, develops it, increases it in size, and gives it a power proportioned to the length of its employment. Whereas the constant lack of use of the same organ insensibly weakens it, deteriorates it, progressively diminishes its powers, and ends by causing it to disappear. This is now known as the law of use and disuse, or kinetogenesis. 4. All that has been acquired or altered in the organization of individuals during their life is preserved by generation and transmitted to new individuals which proceed from those which have undergone these changes. The greatest weakness in the Lamarckian theory is the assumption of the inheritance of acquired characters. This Lamarck took for granted and did not try to demonstrate. As Kellogg has well said, that an animal in its lifetime, and especially during its immature life, can effect very considerable changes in some of its body parts by special use or disuse of these parts, or that certain parts may be modified through the influence of external stimuli, is familiar knowledge. The heart and lungs can be enlarged by special use. In short, almost any of the organs of the body which are actively used can be modified either by unusual or extra use, or by unusual lack of use. Now this use is, in nature, almost always of the character of a better aiding in successful living, that is, it is adaptive use. If such betterment of organs and their functions acquired by individuals could be inherited by their young, it is obvious that general adaptations of this sort could be rapidly developed in the course of generations, and new species, new that is because of the adaptive changes thus affected, be formed. This is the essential thought in Lamarck's theory of the method of adaptation and species forming. The essential principle of Lamarckism is an orthogenetic evolutionary progress toward better and finer adaptation and adjustment resulting from the inherited effects of actual use, disuse, and functional stimulation of parts. It is a great thought and a clear one, and only needs the proof of the actuality of the inheritance of individually acquired characters to make it one of the principal causal explanations of adaptation and species change. However, it is exactly this proof that is wanting. At any rate, proof of the character and extent necessary to convince all or even a majority of biologists is wanting. The examples or cases brought forward by Lamarckians of the alleged inheritance of mutilations, of the results of disease, and of use and disuse are not convincing. It is one of Weismann's positive contributions to biology to have analyzed case after case of alleged inheritance of acquired characters and shown its falseness, or at least uncertainty. Many of these cases he has been able to explain as a result of selection. Others remain inexplicable. A few only are insisted on by the Lamarckian champions as indisputable examples of such inheritance. But this very paucity of so-called proved cases, where there should be thousands of obvious examples if the principle were really sound, is argument against Lamarckism. Our knowledge, too, of the mechanism of heredity makes strongly against the theory of the inheritance of acquired characters. Another of Weismann's positive contributions to biology is his generally sound distinction between the germ plasm and the somaplasm and parts of the many-celled body. At maturity, the animal body is composed of a small mass of germ plasm, germ cells, situated in the ovaries or testes, and a great mass of somatic tissues and organs, all the rest of the body, in fact. Now, what is the condition that exists in the body after a somatic part is modified by use or disuse, or by other functional stimulus, as when a muscle is enlarged by exercise, the sole of the foot calloused by going barefoot, an ear more finely attuned by training? We have a definite physical change in a definite organ, but is the germ plasm in any way changed or affected by this superficial or specific somatic modification? Or, if changed, is it changed so that it will produce in its future development a similar change in the same organ of the future new individual. What possible mechanism have we in the body to produce or ensure such an effect on the germplasm? The answer is obvious and flat. We certainly know of no such mechanism. In fact, what we do know of the relation of the germ cells to the rest of the body makes any satisfactory conception of such a mechanism as yet impossible. But even were the inheritance of acquired characters now an established fact, or if it should come to be one, it must be kept in mind that Lamarckism could be substituted only partly for Darwinism. There are many adaptations and much species forming that Lamarckism might explain, but also there are hosts of adaptations that Lamarckism cannot explain. A number of American biologists have added to the principles of Lamarck that of natural selection. Without denying to natural selection a more or less important part in the process of organic evolution, members of this school believe that much greater importance ought to be assigned to the inherited effects of use and disuse than was assigned to these agencies by Darwin. It is obvious that neo-Lamarckism has to face the problem of the heredity of acquired characters. This is the fundamental and as yet unproved proposition of the theory. The Darwinian theory is based upon variations which occur in all directions, unfavorable as well as favorable, and hence are known as indeterminate variations. Definite lines of development are produced from these chance variations by the elimination in the struggle for existence of all other lines. That is, natural selection permits only certain kinds of variation to persist and to accumulate. According to this theory, the persistence of the useful is explained, but there are certain phenomena which cannot so easily be explained. Among these may be mentioned development along definite lines which are not advantageous and overdevelopment of parts to a harmful degree. Moreover, there is difficulty in explaining the beginnings of advantageous modifications from fluctuating individual variations. It is to explain these phenomena that the theory of orthogenesis has been developed. According to the theory of orthogenesis, variations are predetermined and hence development is fixed along definite lines. There are various views as to the origin of these predetermined variations. The Lamarckians would base them on the perpetuation and accumulation of the effects of use and disuse, etc. Roux would explain them on the battle of the parts theory, and Weismann on the germinal selection theory, referred to later in this chapter. Many phases of the theory of orthogenesis have been advanced by Nageli, Eimer, Cope, and others. Some of these go so far as to say that orthogenesis takes the place of natural selection. Nageli belongs to this school, and he believes that animals and plants would have developed about as they have, even had no struggle for existence taken place, and the climate and geologic conditions and changes been quite different from what they actually have been, says Kellogg. Others hold that orthogenesis is an adjunct of natural selection. Prominent among the latter is Professor Whitman of Chicago, who sees no fundamental contradiction between the theories, and who believes that orthogenesis and natural selection are factors of evolution working together at times. In other words, determinate orthogenetic variations are preserved by natural selection, a conclusion which appeals to many biologists as most reasonable. Associated with the name of De Vries, the Amsterdam botanist, is the mutation theory, or heterogenesis. But this general conception of species forming on a basis of the occurrence of occasional, sudden, fixed, and often considerable changes or variations in the offspring of a plant or animal is a conception not of course new with De Vries, but one variously expressed by numerous biologists from Darwin's time on, especially by von Kolliker, Galton, Dahl, Bateson, Emery, Scott, and Korchinski. It is, however, chiefly due to the patient, persistent, well-planned, and extensive experiments and observations of De Vries that this theory of species forming by heterogenesis, or as called by De Vries by mutations, has recently received so much renewed attention. The meaning of heterogenesis, says Kellogg, in connection with species forming and descent is essentially this. Whereas by the Darwinian theory, species are transformed slowly and by slight changes in at first one or two or a few, and only later in more parts, and all new species are derived from the old ones, which usually disappear as the new ones appear, by the gradual selection of the advantageous ones among the regular slight fluctuating individual variations, known commonly as Darwinian variations and which mostly occur according to the law of error. By the theory of heterogenesis, new species appear suddenly, not by a selective choosing among the slight fluctuating Darwinian variations, but independently of selection and largely independently of the so-called Darwinian variations, by the appearance in fixed definite form of several to many slight to considerable variations, which give the new species definite characteristics, differentiating it often in many particulars from the old species, which differentiating characteristics are fully and faithfully transmitted to the succeeding generations of individuals derived from this suddenly born new species. Extensive observations and experimentation to test the mutation theory are now in progress, and it is too early to form a final opinion as to its bearing on the theory of natural selection. It has been warmly welcomed, but even its friends admit that it needs the support of more experiments and more facts. T.H. Morgan sums up the advantages of the theory as follows. Since the mutations appear fully formed from the beginning, there is no difficulty in accounting for the incipient stages in the development of an organ, and since the organ may persist, even when it has no value to the race, it may become further developed by later mutations and may come to have finally an important relation to the life of the individual. The new mutations may appear in large numbers, and of the different kinds, those will persist that can get a foothold. On account of the large number of times that the same mutations appear, the danger of becoming swamped through crossing with the original form will be lessened in proportion to the number of new individuals that arise. If the time of reaching maturity in the new form is different from that in the parent forms, then the new species will be kept from crossing with the parent form. And since this new character will be present from the beginning, the new form will have much better chances of surviving than if a difference in time of reaching maturity had to be gradually acquired. The new species that appear may be in some cases already adapted to live in a different environment from that occupied by the parent form, and if so, it will be isolated from the beginning, which will be an advantage in avoiding the bad effects of intercrossing. It is well known that the differences between related species consist largely in differences of unimportant organs, and this is in harmony with the mutation theory, but one of the real difficulties of the selection theory. Useless or even slightly injurious characters may appear as mutations, and if they do not seriously affect the perpetuation of the race, they may persist. Still another causal factor of the descent of species is to be found in the isolation theories differently expressed by various authors. Although to many biologists, isolation alone is sufficient to account for the origin of species, most evolutionists consider it to be a very widespread and effective auxiliary theory to natural selection. Selection needs help from just such a factor. Just what is meant by this theory in its different phases, Kellogg describes as follows. If, in a species, a number of individuals show a certain congenital variation, this variation will probably be lost by crossbreeding with individuals not having it, unless the individuals having it are in the majority, or unless they become in some way isolated from the others and segregated so they will breed among themselves. By such isolation and such in-breeding, the newly appearing congenital variations might soon become established, and if advantageous, be so considerably developed as soon to distinguish as a variety or incipient species the members of the isolated colony. With time, a distinct new species might result. Are there means to produce such isolation of groups of individuals belonging to a common species? The answer to this is certainly an affirmative one. There seem to be, indeed, several means of producing isolation, and the isolation may be variously named accordingly. Undoubtedly, the most important of these kinds of isolation, at least in the light of our present knowledge, is that known as geographical or topographical isolation. Isolation produced in other ways may be called biologic or physiologic or sexual isolation. In the case of geographic or topographic isolation, the isolated group or groups of individuals are actually in another region or locality from the rest of the species, this being the result of migration, voluntary or involuntary. In biologic isolation, the individuals of the species all inhabit the same territory, but become separated into groups by structural or physiological characters which prevent miscellaneous interbreeding. The real founder and most insistent upholder of the theory of species forming by isolation, geographic and topographic isolation, was Moritz Wagner, 1813 to 1887, a traveler and naturalist whose wanderings and observations brought to him the conviction that while natural selection might modify species and even produce continuous evolution, it could never differentiate species, that is, produce new species. In support of isolation theories, it is argued by biologists that isolation is very important as one factor in forming species. It is, however, obvious that isolation in itself cannot be the basic and all-sufficient cause for the production of specific differentiation, any more than any selective factor can. The prerequisite in both cases is the occurrence of variation. What are the variations and how are they produced? These are the fundamental questions in species forming. Isolation is a tremendously favoring condition, but not a primary cause of species forming. It tends to help along to hurry up species disintegration, not to initiate it. The germinal selection theory advanced by Weismann attempts to explain the origin of variations. According to Weismann's neo-Darwinism, only congenital variations, those present at birth, are transmissible by heredity. In brief, the theory holds that the germ plasm may be influenced by conditions under which an organism lives and may acquire variations in a determinate or favorable direction. Knowing this factor, we remove, it seems to me, writes Weismann, the patent contradiction of the assumption that the general fitness of organisms or the adaptations necessary to their existence are produced by accidental variations, a contradiction which formed a serious stumbling block to the theory of selection. Though still assuming that primary variations are accidental, I yet hope to have demonstrated that an interior mechanism exists which compels them to go on increasing in a definite direction the moment selection intervenes. Definitely directed variation exists, but not predestined variation running on independently of the life conditions of the organism, as Nageli, to mention the position that the most extreme advocate of this doctrine has assumed. On the contrary, the variation is such as is elicited and controlled by those conditions themselves, though indirectly. There are numerous minor theories proposed to explain difficulties in the more general theories. For these, the reader is referred to special books like Kellogg's Darwinism Today, Jordan and Kellogg's Evolution and Animal Life, and Morgan's Evolution and Adaptation. Most biologists at present seem inclined to look for truth in a combination of the several theories. Thus, Whitman says, natural selection, orthogenesis, and mutation appear to present fundamental contradictions, but I believe that each stands for truth and reconciliation is not distant. The so-called mutations of Inothera are indubitable facts, but two leading questions remain to be answered. First, are these mutations now appearing, as is agreed independently of variation, nevertheless a production of variations that took place at an earlier period in the history of these plants? Secondly, if species can spring into existence at a single leap, without the assistance of cumulative variations, may they not also originate with such assistance? That variation does issue a new species, and that natural selection is a factor, though not the only factor, in determining results, is, in my opinion, as certain as that grass grows, although we cannot see it grow. Furthermore, I believe I have found indubitable evidence of species-forming variation advancing in a definite direction, orthogenesis, and likewise of variations in various directions, amphigenesis. If I am not mistaken in this, the reconciliation for natural selection and orthogenesis is at hand. Others, like H.F. Osborn, think that there are still some unknown factors of evolution. In a lecture entitled The Unknown Factors of Evolution, Osborn says, "The general conclusion we reach from a survey of the whole field is that, for Buffon's and Lamarck's factors, we have no theory of heredity, while the original Darwin factor, or neo-Darwinism, offers an inadequate explanation of evolution. If acquired variations are transmitted, there must be therefore some unknown principle in heredity. If they are not transmitted, there must be some unknown factor in evolution." The present plight seems to be that species forming and evolution are not susceptible of explanation without the help of some Lamarckian factor. And on the other hand, the actuality of any such factor in the light of our present knowledge of heredity cannot be assumed. The discovery of the unknown factors of evolution is therefore one of the most important quests of present-day biologic research. End of section 23.
Section 24 of The Science, History of the Universe, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Warren Kati, Gurnee, Illinois. The Science, History of the Universe, Volume 5, edited by Francis Rolt-Wheeler, Biology. Chapter 15, Heredity, Part 1. No topic in all biology has received so much attention in recent times, both from investigators and from the intelligent public at large, as heredity. The reason for this interest is to be found in the importance of heredity for the individual human life, its practical importance in breeding plants and animals, and its bearing on the evolutionary theory of biology. Its importance in these lines is clearly related by J. Arthur Thomson of Aberdeen in his recent book Heredity. Quote, "There are no scientific problems of greater human interest than those of heredity," he declares. That is to say, the genetic relation between successive generations. Since the issues of the individual life are in great part determined by what the living creature is or has to start with, in virtue of its hereditary relation to parents and ancestors, we cannot disregard the facts of heredity in our interpretation of the past, our conduct in the present, or our forecasting of the future. Great importance undoubtedly attaches to environment in the widest sense: food, climate, housing, scenery, and the animate milieu, and to function in the widest sense: exercise, education, occupation, or the lack of these. But all these potent influences act upon an organism whose fundamental nature is determined, though not rigidly fixed, by its heredity, that is, we repeat, by its genetic relation to its forebears. As Herbert Spencer said, inherited constitution must ever be the chief factor in determining character. And what is important in regard to man's heredity is even more demonstrably important in regard to his domesticated animals and cultivated plants. What has been achieved in the past in regard to horses and cattle, pigeons and poultry, cereals and chrysanthemums, by experimental cleverness and infinite patience, may be surpassed in the future if breeders and cultivators can attain to a better understanding of the more or less obscure laws of inheritance on which all their results depend. The study of heredity is also of fundamental importance in the domain of pure science, in the biologist's attempt to interpret the process of evolution by which the complexities of our present-day fauna and flora have gradually arisen from simpler antecedents. For heredity is obviously one of the conditions of evolution, of continuance as well as of progress. There would have been heredity even if there had been a monotonous world of protists, without any evolution at all. But there could not have been any evolution in the animate world without heredity as one of its conditions. The study of heredity is inextricably bound up with the problems of development, reproduction, fertilization, variation, and so on. In short, it is one of the central themes of biology." End quote. Some outline of the reproduction of organisms is a necessary prelude to a discussion of the theories of heredity. It has been stated that as a rule, individual plants and animate start as a single cell. In the one-celled organisms, the simple division of the parent cell into daughter cells constitutes reproduction. Each of the daughter cells thus formed is a young organism with the power to grow to mature size, divide, and complete a life cycle by reproducing. One unicellular organism today may merge its individuality into 2 offspring in a few hours, and then into 4 in the next few hours, and so on. Many-celled plants and animals begin their individual existence as one-celled ova or ovules, which by oft-repeated cell division produce the thousands of cells found in the body of the larger plants and animals. In these, certain cells are set apart as reproductive cells for the development of new individuals. As is well known, most higher plants and animals have differentiated into male and female sexes. Each produces a peculiar kind of reproductive or germ cell. In animals, the organs of the male, known as spermaries, produce minute cells, sperm cells or spermatozoa, provided with a vibratile appendage capable of causing swimming in fluids. The organs of the female, known as ovaries, produce ova or eggs. These eggs are simple cells, usually incapable of division without fertilization. By swimming, a sperm cell comes into contact with an egg cell, penetrates, and is transformed into a nucleus which moves to meet and fuse with the female nucleus of the egg cell. This entrance and fusion of sperm nucleus with egg nucleus is fertilization. Immediately after the fusion, the fertilized egg or oosperm shows signs of preparation for division by mitosis, and soon the 2-cell stage is formed. In like manner, by mitosis, cleavage again takes place in each of these 2 cells, and there follow stages of 4, 8, 16, 32, etc. cells until the egg has been divided into a mass of cells. Cell division continues, differentiation into tissues takes place, and a folding off of organs goes on until the individual is completely formed. In plants, the process is, in essentials, the same. In the lower plants, even including the mosses and the ferns, the male germ cells are motile and swim to meet the female germ cells. They enter and produce changes similar to those described for animals. In the higher flowering plants, motile male cells are not found. Instead, there are pollen grains adapted to being carried by winds, insects, etc. from the anther of one flower to the pistil of another. From the pollen grain, a delicate tube grows down into the ovary and into contact with the egg cell or ovule of the plant. Down this tube moves a small cell from the inside of the pollen grain. Its nucleus fuses with the egg nucleus, producing fertilization and leading soon to cell division. In brief outline, the above is the story of the usual origin of higher plants and animals in sexual reproduction. The essential point is that new individuals arise from 2 cells, one derived from each parent. Exceptional cases do occur. Some multicellular animals like hydra and certain worms may give rise to buds or divide into 2 or more new animals. This is similar to the power of many plants to reproduce from buds, shoots, or cuttings. This process is known as asexual reproduction, in which also is classed the simple division of one-celled plants and animals. In most cases, organisms with the power of asexual reproduction also multiply by sexual reproduction, but many plants seem to be able to multiply indefinitely by runners, tubers, and so on. Another exception to the general rule that higher individuals develop from the fusion of two germ cells is found among certain species of plant lice, aphides, water fleas, small crustacea, and others, which under certain conditions develop from unfertilized eggs. This is parthenogenesis. With the possible exception of certain scale insects, parthenogenesis among animals is always temporary, and parthenogenetic generations are from time to time, usually in the fall, succeeded by a generation reproducing sexually. Among plants, many species are believed to be permanently parthenogenetic. When such cases are considered, it must be admitted that the vital processes may continue indefinitely, simply by repeated division of the cells themselves, without the intervention of the act of fertilization. Still, on the other hand, it is necessary to conclude, on account of the wide distribution throughout the whole organic kingdom of the phenomenon of fertilization, that this institution is of essential importance among the vital processes and that it is fundamentally connected with the life of the cell. For an understanding of the problems of heredity, the method of development, of sperms, spermatogenesis, and of ova, oogenesis, is necessary, as well as the exact steps of the process by which an oosperm or unicellular embryo is formed by the union of the two sexual elements. In plants and animals, both ovary and spermary are at first composed of cells of the ordinary kind, the primitive sex cells, and it is only by the further development of these that the sex of the gonad is determined. In the spermary, the sex cells undergo repeated fission, forming what are known as the sperm mother cells, in which the number of chromosomes is constant in any given species. The sperm mother cell divides, and the process of division is immediately repeated, the result being that each sperm mother cell gives rise to a group of 4 cells, having half the normal number of chromosomes, the 4 cells so produced being the immature sperms. Thus, the sperm or male gamete is a true cell, and is specifically modified in most cases for active movements. This mitotic division by which the number of chromosomes in the sperm mother cells is reduced by 1/2 is known as a reducing division. As already stated, the ova also arise from primitive sex cells. These divide and give rise to the egg mother cells. The egg mother cells do not immediately undergo division, but remain passive and increase, often enormously, in size, by the absorption of nutriment from surrounding parts. In this way, each egg mother cell becomes an ovum. In addition to increase in the bulk of the protoplasm itself, a formation of plastic products usually goes on to an immense extent, and the ovum may attain a comparatively enormous size, as, for instance, in birds, in which the yolk is simply an immense egg cell. Such an ovum is incapable of being fertilized or of developing into an embryo. Before it is ripe for conjugation with a sperm or able to undergo the first stages of segmentation, it has to go through a process known as the maturation of the egg. Maturation consists essentially in a twice repeated process of cell division by mitosis, and by its means 2 small cells called polar cells are thrown off. The ovum has now lost a portion of its protoplasm, together with 3/4 of its chromatin, half having passed into the first polar cell and half of what remained into the second. The remaining 1/4 of the chromatin takes on a rounded form and is distinguished as the female pronucleus. The formation of both polar cells takes place by a reducing division, so that while the immature ovum contains the number of chromosomes found in the ordinary cells of the species, the mature ovum, like the sperm, contains only 1/2 the normal number. Shortly after, or in some cases before maturation, the ovum is fertilized by the conjugation with it of a single sperm. Sperms are produced in vastly greater numbers than ova, and it often happens that a single egg is seen quite surrounded with sperms, all apparently about to conjugate with it. It has, however, been found to be a general rule that only one of these actually conjugates. The others, like the drones in a beehive, perish without fulfilling the one function they are fitted to perform. The sperm and egg nuclei approach one another and finally unite to form what is called the segmentation nucleus, the single nucleus of what is not now the ovum, but the oosperm, the impregnated egg or unicellular embryo. The fertilizing process is thus seen to consist of the union of two nuclear bodies, one contributed by the male gamete or sperm, the other by the female gamete or ovum. It follows from this that the essential nuclear matter or chromatin of the oosperm is derived in equal proportions from each of the two parents. Moreover, as both male and female pronuclei contain only half the number of chromosomes found in the ordinary cells of the species, the union of the pronuclei results in the restoration of the normal number to the oosperm. Fertilization being thus effected, the process of segmentation or division of the oosperm takes place as described. The significance of these observed phenomena of maturation, fertilization, and cell division in modern theories of inheritance will be apparent. The main facts of organic reproduction which are fundamental to a consideration of the modern problems of heredity having been outlined, a brief survey of some of the most prominent theories of heredity which have been advanced during the last 2 centuries will be given, after which attention will be directed to the present-day problems of heredity, including Mendelism, or the experimental study of heredity, and those cytological problems which have as their aim the identification of the inheritance material in the germ cells. It is not strange that, of the many attempts at theories of heredity, the early ones were essentially mystical and fell back on the supernatural to explain what could not be seen. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries there prevailed a theory of preformation. The believers in this theory, men like Boulais and Haller, maintained the preformations of the organism and all its parts within the egg. They regarded the apparent new formation of organs during development as an illusion, and held that development was merely an unfolding of this preformed miniature. Moreover, they believed that the germ contained not only a preformation of the organism into which it was to grow, but of successive generations as well. To quote from Thomson, "Preformed miniature lay within preformed miniature in ever-increasing minuteness, as if in a conjurer's box. Thus it was computed that Mother Eve must have included over 200,000 millions of homunculi, or sometimes it was Adam who was made to bear this burden. For according to one party, the ovists, e.g. Malpighi, it was the ovum that contained the miniature which had to be unfolded, while according to others, the animalculists, it was the sperm which contained the preformed model." End quote. But how the germ came to have this preformed model they could not tell. Caspar Friedrich Wolff was the first to raise a strong protest against the speculations of the preformationists and to advance a new theory. Appealing to facts, he showed that in the early stages of the chick's development there was no visible hint of a preformed miniature, but that various organs made their appearance successively and gradually and were to be seen being formed. He held that there is a new formation or epigenesis, but how the germ that seems to start anew every time can develop as it does, the upholders of the theory of epigenesis could not tell. For their ultimate explanations of heredity, both schools fell back on the assumption of hyperphysical agencies as the earlier theorists had done before them. Passing from these mystical interpretations of the phenomena of heredity, there are a whole series of theories which are in varying degrees scientific and may be fairly described by the general designation pangenetic. Thomson, in The Science of Life and in Heredity, gives good accounts of the various theories of heredity. From these works the material in this section has been taken. These theories all have this in common, that they seek to explain the uniqueness of the germ cell by regarding it as the center of contributions from different parts of the organism, a collection of samples from the various organs. Spencer, Darwin, Jaeger, Galton, Brooks, and others at one time or another contributed toward these theories. In 1864, Spencer suggested the existence of physiological units derived from and capable of development into cells, and supposed that they accumulated in the germ cells, which thus became, in a conceivable sense, miniature organisms. The best-known theory of this class is the provisional hypothesis of pangenesis, enunciated by Darwin in 1868. The main suggestions of this theory are as follows. Every cell of the body, not too highly differentiated, throws off characteristic gemmules. These multiply by fission, retaining their characteristics. They become specially concentrated in the reproductive elements in both sexes. In development, the gemmules unite with others like themselves, and grow into cells like those from which they were originally given off, or they remain latent during development through several generations. By means of this theory, Darwin attempted to explain not only the simpler facts of heredity, but also, quote, those very curious but abundant cases in which a character is transmitted in a latent form and at last reappears after many generations, such cases being known as atavism or reversion, and again, those cases of latent transmission in which characteristics special to the male are transmitted to the male offspring through the female parent without being manifest in her, and, yet again, the appearance at a particular period of life of characters inherited and remaining latent in the young organism, end quote, as Lancaster expresses it. The great defect of this theory is obviously its entirely hypothetical character. No one has ever observed any gemmules. Moreover, it is not in harmony with the results of experiments, e.g., on transfusion of blood, or with what is known as the physiology of cells or with the facts of experimental inheritance. The next theory to be noted is the theory of genetic or germinal continuity. This theory was first suggested by Owen in 1849. Since then, Haeckel, Jaeger, Brooks, Galton, Nussbaum, Weissman, and a score of others have contributed toward it. In its earlier conception, this geminal continuity consisted in a continuity of germ cells. A summary of this idea follows. At an early stage in the embryo, the future reproductive cells of the organism are often distinguishable from those which are forming the body. The latter develop in manifold variety and lose almost all likeness to the mother germ. The former, the reproductive rudiments, are not implicated in the differentiation of the body, remain virtually unchanged, and continue the protoplasmic tradition unaltered. As the sex cells of the offspring are thus continuous with the parental sex cells which give rise to it, they will, in turn, develop into similar organisms. In this view, the reproductive cells form a continuous chain, and the reproduction of like by like is natural and necessary. But a serious difficulty besets this doctrine, for a direct chain of cellular continuity can only be said to exist in a few cases. Thus, this theory of the continuity of the germ cells has been replaced by the newer theory of the continuity of the germ plasm. This is Weissman's theory. Weissman has worked it out in the minutest details. The problems which he discusses are too intricate and technical for any but a special student. For present purposes, a very brief summary, as expressed by Thomson, will be sufficient. Quote, a living creature usually takes its origin from a fertilized egg cell, from a union of an ovum and a spermatozoon. These germ cells are descended by a continuous cell division from the fertilized ova which gave rise to the two parents. They have retained the organization of the fertilized ova, and this organization has its vehicle in the chromatin of the nucleus, the germ plasm. This germ plasm consists of several chromosomes, or idants, each of which is made up of several pieces, or ids, each of which, here hypothesis begins, is supposed to contain all the potentialities, generic, specific, and individual, of a new organism. Each id is a microcosm with an architecture which has been elaborated for ages. It is supposed to consist of numerous determinants, one for each part of the organism that is capable of varying independently or of being independently expressed during development. Lastly, each determinant is pictured as consisting of a number of ultimate vital particles of biophores, which are eventually liberated in the cytoplasm of the various embryonic cells. All these units of various grades are capable of growth and of multiplication by division. End quote. In its more general aspects, this view of Weissman's represents what might be called the dominant modern view. That is, there is general belief that the germ cell inherits from the parental germ cells an organization of great complexity, including an intricate architecture of minute particles which are the material bearers of particular inheritance qualities. Not all biologists, however, agree with Weissman in his limitation of the inheritance material to the chromosomes. It is here that the inheritance problems of today have their beginning. End of section 24. Recording by Warren Kati, Gurnee, Illinois. Section 25 of The Science, History of the Universe, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Warren Kati, Gurnee, Illinois. The Science, History of the Universe, Volume 5, edited by Francis Rolt-Wheeler, Biology. Chapter 15, Heredity, Part 2. Much attention has in recent years been given to the experimental study of variation and heredity. These experiments are of interest in connection with Mendel's law, a law so important in the science of biology that Professor Bateson has written of it, quote, "The experiments which led to this advance in knowledge are worthy to rank with those that laid the foundation of the atomic laws of chemistry." End quote. The discoverer of this law was Gregor Johann Mendel, 1822 to 1884, an Augustinian monk. He was a man of varied interest, and in his gardens performed many hybridization experiments on plants. In 1866 he published a paper giving the results of his experiments, entitled Experiments in Plant Hybridization. This paper did not attract much attention at the time, probably because of the enthusiasm and the controversy evoked by the natural selection theory, and lay practically unknown in the proceedings of the Natural History Society of Brünn for over 30 years. A revival of interest in the experimental study of variation and heredity at about the beginning of the present century led to the rediscovery of the Mendelian principles of heredity by several botanists working separately. In about that time, Bateson brought into prominence Mendel's work and by a long series of experiments confirmed and extended it. To gain an idea of the scope of these principles, one cannot do better than turn to Mendel's own account of his experiments. Punnet's Mendelism and Thomson's Heredity gives such an account, and from these sources the following statements have largely been taken. In the selection of a plant for experiment, Mendel recognized that two conditions must be fulfilled. In the first place, the plant must possess differentiating characters, and secondly, the hybrids must be protected from the influence of foreign pollen during the flowering period. In the edible pea, Mendel found an almost ideal plant to work with. The separate flowers are self-fertilizing, while complications from insect interference are practically non-existent. As is well known, there are numerous varieties of the eating pea, exhibiting characters to which they breed true. In some varieties, the seed color is yellow, while in others it is green. In some varieties, the seeds are round and smooth when ripe, in others they are wrinkled. Some peas have purple, others have pure white flowers. Some peas, again, when grown under ordinary conditions, attain to a height of 6 to 7 feet, while others are dwarfs, which do not exceed 1.5 to 2 feet. Mendel selected a certain number of such differentiating characters and investigated their inheritance separately for each character. Thus, in one series of experiments, he concentrated his attention on the heights of the plants. Crosses were made between tall and dwarf varieties, which previous experience had shown to come true to type with regard to these characters. It mattered not which was the pollen-producing and which was the seed-bearing plant. In every case, the result was the same. Tall plants resulted from the cross. For this reason, Mendel applied the terms dominant and recessive to the tall and dwarf habits, respectively. In the next generation, the crossbred plants, products of dominant and recessive, or recessive and dominant, but all apparently like dominant, were allowed to fertilize themselves, with the result that their offspring exhibited the two original forms, on the average 3 dominants to 1 recessive. Out of 1,064 plants, 787 were tall, 277 were dwarfs. When these recessive dwarfs were allowed to fertilize themselves, they gave rise to recessive dwarfs only. For any number of generations, the recessive character bred true. When the dominants, on the other hand, were allowed to fertilize themselves, they produced 1/3 of pure dominants, producing dominants only when self-fertilized, and 2/3 of crossbred dominants, which on self-fertilization again gave rise to a mixture of dominants and recessives in the proportion of 3:1. If, in an experiment with mice, a gray house mouse is crossed with a white mouse, the offspring are all gray. Grayness is dominant. Albinism is recessive. The gray hybrids are inbred. Their offspring are gray and white in the proportion of 3:1. If these whites are inbred, they show themselves pure, for they produce whites only for subsequent generations. But when the grays are inbred, they show themselves of two kinds, for 1/3 of them produce only grays, which go on producing grays, while the other 2/3, apparently the same, produce both grays and whites, and so it goes on. In his exceedingly clear exposition of Mendelism, 1905, R.C. Punnett states the result thus, quote, "Wherever there occurs a pair of differentiating characters, of which one is dominant to the other, three possibilities exist. There are recessives, which always breed true to the recessive character. There are dominants, which breed true to the dominant character, and are therefore pure. And thirdly, there are dominants which may be called impure, and which, on self-fertilization, or inbreeding where the sexes are separate, give both dominant and recessive forms in the fixed proportion of 3 of the former to 1 of the latter." End quote. To explain such phenomena, Mendel suggested that the hybrid produces in equal numbers 2 kinds of germ cells, 2 kinds of egg cells, or 2 kinds of pollen grains. That there is, in the developing reproductive organ, a segregation of germ cells into 2 equal camps, one camp with the potential quality of tallness, the other camp with the potential quality of dwarfness. Thus, if there are 6 ovules, 3 contain in their egg cell the primary constituent corresponding to tallness, and 3 contain the primary constituent corresponding to dwarfness. Each of these is pollinated by a pollen grain, which, by hypothesis, contains the potential quality of tallness or of dwarfness, and if the 2 kinds of pollen grains are present in equal numbers, each ovule has an equal chance of being fertilized by a pollen grain with the potential quality of tallness, or by a pollen grain with the potential quality of dwarfness. Therefore, the result must be a set of offspring partly dominant and partly recessive in the proportions of 3:1. Mendel discovered an important set of facts, and he also suggested a theoretical interpretation, the theory of gametic segregation. As Batson says, quote, "The essential part of the discovery is the evidence that the germ cells or gametes produced by crossbred organisms may, in respect of given characters, be of the pure parental types, and consequently incapable of transmitting the opposite character, that when such pure similar gametes of opposite sexes are united in fertilization, the individuals so formed and their posterity are free from all taint of the cross, that there may be, in short, perfect or almost perfect discontinuity between these germs in respect of one of each pair of opposite characters." End quote. This law of the segregation of gametes accords well with the experimental and observed phenomena of heredity. But this brings up the question, is there any known process by which such a segregation could be brought about during the history of the germ cells? Quote, "Is it," says Thomson, "enough simply to say that the germ cells are little living unities with an organization, an equilibrium of their own, and that they tend, as they multiply, to become more stable, namely, by separating out incompatibilities, dominant and recessive potential unit characters, and becoming the vehicle of either the one or the other? Are there differential divisions during the development of the germ cells which lead to there being 2 camps of gametes, which we may briefly describe as pure potential dominants and pure potential recessives? Is this not a possible expression of a struggle between the hereditary items and in line with Weismann's theory of germinal selection?" End quote. Quote, "A more precise suggestion," says T.H. Morgan, "to which it seems too soon to attach great significance, is the fascinating hypothesis that the segregation occurs during the maturation division. If we assume that the chromosomes are the vehicles of the hereditary qualities, which seems highly probable, if we assume further that a particular potential unit character is contained in each germ cell in one chromosome and not in others, which seems a difficult assumption, then it is possible that Sutton may be correct in his suggestion that the segregation of gametes into two sets occurs in the course of the maturation division." End quote. A great deal of work confirming Mendel's experiences has been done both with plants and animals in laboratories in many countries, with the result that, although there are some difficulties and not a few discrepancies, quote, "the truth of the law," as Batson says, "is now established for a large number of cases of most dissimilar character." End quote. On the other hand, there has been much experimentation in which the results do not harmonize with the Mendelian results. Thomson says, quote, "There seems at present no reason to believe that the Mendelian formula has more than a limited application, though it is, of course, possible that apparent exceptions may eventually turn out to be less formidable than they seem. There seems no reason why there should not be several formulae of inheritance, each applicable to particular sets of cases, e.g., to cases where blending does occur and to cases where it never occurs. As the method of experiment is obviously the surest line of progress, the more it is prosecuted, the sooner will the mists surrounding heredity disappear. But progress cannot be secured by ignoring difficult cases or by straining the formula in the eager desire to universalize it." End quote. Extensive theoretical and practical applications of Mendel's law to problems of biology have been made. For the technical discussion of Mendel's law in connection with persistence in evolution and in relation to definite variations, reference must be made to some of the detailed studies on Mendelism. The following illustrations from Thomson and from Punnett will show its value to practical breeders. Some kinds of wheat are very susceptible to the fungoid disease known as rust. Others are immune. The quality of immunity to rust is recessive to the quality of predisposition to rust. When an immune and a non-immune strain are crossed together, the resulting hybrids are all susceptible to rust. On self-fertilization, such hybrids produce seed from which appear dominant rusts and recessive immune plants in the expected ratio of 3:1. From this simple experiment, the phrase "resistance to disease" has acquired a more precise significance, and the wide field of research here opened up in this connection promises results of the utmost practical as well as theoretical importance. "The new science of heredity has much to teach the practical man," says Punnett. "Let us suppose that he has two varieties, each possessing a desirable character, and that he wishes to combine these characters in a third form. He must not be disappointed if he makes his cross and finds that none of the hybrids approach the ideal which he has set before himself, for if he raises a further generation he will obtain the thing which he desires. He may, for example, possess tall green-seeded and dwarf yellow-seeded peas, and may wish to raise a strain of green dwarfs. He makes his cross, and nothing but tall yellows result. At first sight he would appear to be further than ever from his end, for the hybrids differ more from the plant at which he is aiming than did either of the original parents. Nevertheless, if he sow the seeds of these hybrids, he may look forward with confidence to the appearance of the dwarf green, and owing to the recessive nature of both greenness and dwarfness, he can be certain that for further generations the dwarf greens thus produced will come true to type. The green dwarfs are all fixed as soon as they appear, and will throw neither tails nor yellows. The less the hybrid resembles the form at which the breeder aims, the more likely is that form to breed true when it appears in the next generation. In the years since 1900, there has been deep interest in the microscopic study of germ cells in the search for the mechanism of heredity. Much observation and experimentation has been done, and there has been a rapid advance in knowledge, but so intricate are the questions involved that investigation is most difficult and only a start at the problems has been made. In an address before the American Association for the Advancement of Science in December 1907, E.G. Conklin well summarizes the arguments in support of the two general views under which opinions concerning the material bearers of inheritance may be said to be grouped, namely, the view that the chromosomes of the germ cell are the bearers of heredity, and the view that inheritance may take place through the cytoplasm of the germ cells. A few of the less technical paragraphs of this paper are as follows. In practically all theories of heredity, it is assumed that there is a specific inheritance material distinct from the general protoplasm, whose function is the transmission of hereditary properties from generation to generation, and whose characteristics, as compared with the general protoplasm, are greater stability, independence, and continuity. This is the idioplasm of Nageli, the germ plasm of Weizmann. It is further assumed that this germ plasm is itself composed of ultramicroscopical units, which are capable of undergoing transformation during the course of development into the structures of the adult. However necessary such units may be for a complete philosophical explanation of development, it must be confessed that at present they constitute a purely hypothetical system which may or may not correspond to reality. We know that germ cells are exceedingly complex, that they contain many visible units such as chromosomes, chromomeres, and microsomes, and that with every great improvement in the microscope and in microscopical technique, other structures are made visible which were invisible before, and whether the hypothetical units just named are present or not seems to be a matter of no great importance, seeing that, so far as the analysis of the microscope is able to go, there are differentiated units which are combined into a system. In short, there is organization. On the other hand, the evidence in favor of an inheritance material, which is distinct from the general protoplasm of the germ and whose function is the reproduction of hereditary characters, is not convincing. All the living substance of the egg cell is converted into the mature organism. That there is a species plasm or an individual plasm which is continuous from generation to generation, and from which all the qualities of the mature organism are differentiated, is almost a certainty, but there is no satisfactory evidence that this substance is distinct from the general protoplasm of the young germ cells. Differentiation, and hence heredity, consists in the main in the appearance of unlike substances in protoplasm and their localization in definite regions or cells. Unfortunately, we do not know many of the steps by which different substances appear within protoplasm, but in all cases which have been carefully studied, one significant fact appears, vis-a-vis the importance of the interaction of the nucleus and cytoplasm. In many cases, various substances have been seen to come out of the nucleus and to mingle with the cytoplasm, while the nucleus in turn absorbs substances from the cytoplasm. It is known that constructive metabolism, differentiation, and regeneration never occur in the absence of a nucleus. Turning now to the differentiations of the fertilized egg cell, we find that different substances appear in the egg cell and become localized in different regions of the egg or embryo. It is known that there is an active interchange of nuclear and cytoplasmic substances. In the long growth period of the egg, the nucleus grows enormously, evidently at the expense of substances received from the cell body. On the other hand, it is well established that substances issue from the nucleus into the cell body and mingle with the cytoplasm during this stage. Finally, we may conclude that the nucleus plays a less important role in the localization of different substances than in the formation of those substances. Nevertheless, in differentiation, as well as in metabolism, there is every reason to believe that the entire cell is a physiological unit. Neither the nucleus nor the cytoplasm can exist long independently of the other. Differentiations are dependent upon the interaction of these two parts of the cell. The entire germ cell, and not merely the nucleus or cytoplasm, is transformed into the embryo or larva, and it therefore seems necessary to conclude that both nucleus and cytoplasm are involved in the mechanism of heredity. It may be considered as definitely settled that the early development of animals is of purely maternal type, and that it is only after the broad outlines of development and the general type of differentiation have been established that the influence of the spermatozoon begins to make itself felt, and it is equally certain that this type of differentiation is predetermined in the cytoplasm of the mature egg cell rather than in the egg nucleus. On the other hand, there is no doubt that the differentiations of the egg cytoplasm have arisen, in the main, during the ovarian history of the egg, and as a result of the interaction of nucleus and cytoplasm. But the fact remains that at the time of fertilization, the hereditary potencies of the two germ cells are not equal. all the early development, including the polarities, symmetry, type of cleavage, and the relative positions and proportions of future organs, being predetermined in the cytoplasm of the egg cell, while only the differentiations of later development are influenced by the sperm. In short, the egg cytoplasm fixes the type of development, and the sperm and egg nuclei supply only the details. This conclusion is not a refutation of the nuclear inheritance theory, but it is a profound modification of it. At once, it destroys the argument that since there is equality of inheritance from both parents, there must be equivalence of inheritance material in egg and sperm. So far as those characteristics are concerned which appear late in development, it is highly probable that there is equality of inheritance from both parents, but in the early and main features of development, hereditary traits, as well as material substance, are derived chiefly from the mother. In the light of the conclusion that only the later and more detailed differentiations are influenced by the sperm, it follows that experimental work which aims to modify the fundamental features of an organism must be directed to the ovarian egg rather than to the sperm or to the developing embryo. In conclusion, the following paragraphs from E.B. Wilson's The Cell in Development and Inheritance will indicate the present state of the cytological study of inheritance problems and the outlook for the future. We have now arrived, he says, at the farthest outpost of cell research, and here we find ourselves confronted with the same unsolved problems before which the investigators of evolution have made a halt. For we must now inquire what is the guiding principle of embryological development that correlates its complex phenomena and directs them to a definite end. However we conceive the special mechanism of development, we cannot escape the conclusion that the power behind it is involved in the structure of the germ plasm inherited from foregoing generations. What is the nature of this structure and how has it been acquired? To the first of these questions we have, as yet, no certain answer. The second question is merely the general problem of evolution stated from the standpoint of the cell theory. The first question raises once more the old puzzle of pre-formation or epigenesis. The pan-gen hypothesis of De Vries and Weismann recognizes the fact that development is epigenetic in its external features, but, like Darwin's hypothesis of pangenesis, it is at bottom a theory of pre-formation, and Weismann expresses the conviction that it is an impossibility. The truth is that an explanation of development is at present beyond our reach. The controversy between preformation and epigenesis has now arrived at a stage where it has little meaning apart from the general problems of physical causality. What we know is that a specific kind of living substance, derived from the parent, tends to run through a specific cycle of changes during which it transforms itself into a body like that of which it formed a part, and we are able to study with greater or less precision the mechanism by which that transformation is effected and the conditions under which it takes place. But despite all our theories, we no more know how the organization of the germ cell involves the properties of the adult body than we know how the properties of hydrogen and oxygen involve those of water. So long as the chemist and physicist are unable to solve so simple a problem of physical causality as this, the embryologist may well be content to reserve his judgment on a problem 100-fold more complex. The second question regarding the historical origin of the idioplasm brings us to the side of the evolutionists. The idioplasm of every species has been derived, as we must believe, by the modification of a pre-existing idioplasm through variation and the survival of the fittest. Whether these variations first arise in the idioplasm of the germ cells, as Weismann maintains, or whether they may arise in the body cells and then be reflected back upon the idioplasm, is a question to which the study of the cell has thus far given no certain answer. Whatever position we take on this question, the same difficulty is encountered, namely the origin of that coordinated fitness, that power of active adjustment between internal and external relations, which, as so many eminent biological thinkers have insisted, overshadows every manifestation of life. The nature and origin of this power is the fundamental problem of biology. It may be true, as Schwann himself urged, that the adaptive power of living beings differs in degree only, not in kind, from that of unorganized bodies. It is true that we may trace in organic nature long and finely graduated series leading upward from the lower to the higher forms, and we must believe that the wonderful adaptive manifestations of the more complex forms have been derived from simpler conditions through the progressive operation of natural causes. But when all these admissions are made, and when the conserving action of natural selection is in the fullest degree recognized, we cannot close our eyes to two facts. First, that we are utterly ignorant of the manner in which the idioplasm of the germ cell can so respond to the influence of the environment as to call forth an adaptive variation. And second, that the study of the cell has, on the whole, seemed to widen rather than to narrow the enormous gap that separates even the lowest forms of life from the inorganic world. I am well aware that, to many, such a conclusion may appear reactionary or even to involve a renunciation of what has been regarded as the ultimate aim of biology. In reply to such criticism, I can only express my conviction that the magnitude of the problem of development, whether ontogenetic or phylogenetic, has been underestimated, and that the progress of science is retarded rather than advanced by a premature attack upon its ultimate problems. Yet the splendid achievements of cell research in the past 20 years stand as the promise of its possibilities for the future, and we need set no limit to its advance. To Schleiden and Schwann, the present standpoint of the cell theory might well have seemed unattainable. We cannot foretell its future triumphs, nor can we doubt that the way has already been opened to better understanding of inheritance and development. End of section 25. Recording by Warren Kati, Gurnee, Illinois.
Section 26 of The Science History of the Universe, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Availle in February 2017. The Science History of the Universe, Volume 5, edited by Francis Rolt-Wheeler. Biology, Chapter 16, Adaptation, Part 1. Although but one element of organic evolution, the origin of species, has been emphasized in the preceding pages, it has been noticed perhaps in the various discussions brought up that evolution is concerned not only with the great variety of life kinds, but also with the adaptedness or adaptiveness of life kinds to various sorts of life conditions. As Kellogg phrases it, the task of an evolution explanation is a double one. It must explain not only diversity or variety in life, but adaptive diversity or variety. The most striking fact in nature is this adaptation of organisms to their environment. On every side, plants and animals seem to be well fitted to their particular places in nature. Every organism seems to have been constructed after an ideal plan, and it is not surprising that so many observers of nature have believed that plants and animals were specially designed and created to fit the places in nature which they fill. Verworn says, "The fact of purposefulness in living nature, which was so marvelous to men of science in early times, even down to the middle of the present century, forced them constantly to embrace teleology, that is, the hypothesis of a foreordained plan of creation, such as dogmatic theology, preserving faithfully the ancient venerated ideas, except today. This purposefulness in nature is the simple expression, or better, the result, of the adaptation of organisms to their vital conditions in the widest sense. Thus, all animals have their essential organs adapted to habitat, food, and various conditions of environment. Fishes have limbs in the form of fins, which function very perfectly as rowing organs. Terrestrial vertebrates have in place of fins legs for walking and creeping upon dry land. Birds have wings, constructed most fittingly, with which their light bodies, supported by bones containing air, soar through the air so perfectly that imitation of them is difficult. Likewise, plants are so perfectly adapted to their surroundings in the general plan and arrangement of root, stem, leaf, flower, etc., that only the special student is likely to recognize the adaptation. In fact, these general adaptations of organs and functions of plants and animals are so universal that they have ceased to excite wonder and are taken as necessary phenomena of life. They are necessary phenomena of life, for general adaptations are as natural as breathing, eating, and so on. In addition to the general adaptations to widespread conditions of environment, for example, to the general conditions under which all land animals and plants, or all aquatic animals and plants must live, there are myriads of special adaptations. For example, all fishes living in fresh water have in common general adaptations to an aquatic life, but fishes living in caverns have, in addition to the general adaptations, certain special adaptive modifications in accordance with their special environment, especially in the eyes, which are profoundly modified in accordance with a life spent habitually in darkness. Likewise, all plants living on land have a general adaptation to terrestrial life, but in addition many have special adaptations. All plants which have green leaves use them for starch formation under the action of sunlight, but special adaptations fit certain species to different degrees of light intensity, and as a result, one plant may be fitted to grow in open fields, while another will grow but in shaded places. Special adaptations have attracted much attention from students, because by contrast with general adaptations, they prove valuable in evolutionary studies. For the sake of convenience, the special adaptations of plants and animals will be considered separately, and also color adaptations will be treated in a separate section. However, this is purely an arbitrary division, for all studies of the special adaptations of plants and animals lead to the same conclusion, namely that these adaptations have originated through the processes of evolution. One of the best collections of facts concerning special adaptations is to be found in the extended chapter on this subject in Jordan and Kellogg's Evolution and Animal Life, from which some of the most striking examples have been selected for use here. The various types of special adaptations may be roughly divided into 5 classes as follows: food securing, self-defense, defense of young, rivalry, and adjustment to surroundings. For the purpose of capture of their prey, most carnivorous animals are provided with strong claws, sharp teeth, hooked beaks, and other structures familiar to us in the lion, tiger, dog, cat, owl, and eagle. Insect-eating mammals have contrivances especially adapted for the catching of insects. The ant-eater, for example, has a long, sticky tongue which it thrusts forth from its cylindrical snout deep into the recesses of the anthill, bringing it out with its surface covered with ants. Animals which feed on nuts are fitted with strong teeth or beaks for cracking them. Strong teeth are found in those fishes which feed on crabs or sea urchins. Those mammals like the horse and cow that feed on plants have usually broad chisel-like incisor teeth for cutting off the foliage, and teeth of very similar form are developed in different groups of plant-eating fishes. Molar teeth are found when it is necessary that the food should be crushed or chewed, and the sharp canine teeth go with a flesh diet. The long neck of the giraffe enables it to browse on the foliage of trees in grassless regions. Insects like the leaf beetles and the grasshoppers that feed on the foliage of plants have a pair of jaws, broad but sharply edged, for cutting off bits of leaves and stems. Those which take only liquid food, as the butterflies and sucking bugs, have their mouth parts modified to form a slender, hollow sucking beak or proboscis, which can be thrust into a flower nectary or into the green tissues of plants, or the flesh of animals to suck up nectar or plant sap or blood, according to the special food habits of the insect. The honeybee has a very complicated equipment of mouthparts fitted for taking either solid food, like pollen, or liquid food, like the nectar of flowers. The mosquito has a bill composed of 6 sharp, slender needles for piercing and lacerating the flesh, and a long tubular underlip through which the blood can flow into the mouth. Some predaceous insects, as the praying horse, have their forelegs developed into formidable grasping organs for seizing and holding their prey. For self-protection, the higher animals depend largely on the same organs and instincts as for the securing of food. Carnivorous beasts use tooth and claw in their own defense, as well as in securing their prey, but these, as well as other animals, may protect themselves in other fashions. Many of the higher animals are provided with horns, structures useless in procuring food, but effective as weapons of defense. Others defend themselves by blows with their strong hoofs. Among the reptiles and fishes, and even among the mammals, the defensive coat of mail is found in great variety. The crab and lobster, with claws and carapace, are well defended against their enemies, and the hermit crab, with its well-known habitude of thrusting its unprotected body within a cast-off shell of a sea snail, finds in this instinct a perfect defense. Insects also, especially beetles, are protected by their coats of mail. Scales and spines of many sorts serve to defend the bodies of reptiles and fishes, while feathers protect the bodies of birds, and hair those of most mammals. The ways in which animals make themselves disagreeable or dangerous to their captors are almost as varied as the animals themselves. Besides the teeth, claws, and horns of ordinary attack and defense, there are found among the mammals many special structures or contrivances which serve for defense through making their possessors unpleasant. The turtles are all protected by bony shields, and some of them, the box turtles, may close their shields almost hermetically. The snakes broaden their heads, swell their necks, or show their forked tongues to frighten their enemies. Some of them are further armed with fangs connected with a venom gland, so that to most animals their bite is deadly. Even the fishes have many modes of self-defense through giving pain or injury to animals who would swallow them. The catfish, or horned pout, when attacked, sets immovably the sharp spine of the pectoral fin, inflicting a jagged wound. Pelicans which have swallowed a catfish have been known to die of the wounds inflicted by the fish's spine. In the group of scorpion fishes and toadfishes are certain genera in which these spines are provided with poison glands. Many fishes are defended by a coat of mail or a coat of sharp spines. The globefishes and porcupine fishes are for the most part defended by spines, but their instinct to swallow air gives them an additional safeguard. When one of these fishes is disturbed, it rises to the surface, gulps air until its capacious stomach is filled, and then floats, belly upward, on the water. It is thus protected from other fishes, though easily taken by man. The torpedo, electric eel, electric catfish, and stargazer surprise and stagger their captors by means of electric shocks. The shock is felt severely if the fish be stabbed with a knife or metallic spear. The electric eel of the rivers of Paraguay and southern Brazil is said to give severe shocks to herds of wild horses driven through the streams, and similar accounts are given of the electric catfish of the Nile. In tropical seas the tangs, or surgeon fishes, are provided with a knife-like spine on the side of the tail, the sharp edge directed forward and slipping into a sheath. This is a formidable weapon when the fish is alive. Other fishes defend themselves by spears, swordfish, spearfish, sailfish, or by saws, sawfish, saw shark, or by paddles, paddlefish. Others still make use of sucking discs of one sort or another, as in the snailfish, the clingfish, and the goby, to cling to the underside of rocks, or, as in the remora, to the bodies of swift-moving sharks. Blind fishes in the caves are adapted to their condition. In similar circumstances, salamanders, crayfishes, and insects are also blind. Some fishes, as the lancelet, lie buried in the sand all their lives. Others, as the sand darter and the hinalea, bury themselves in the sand at intervals to escape from their enemies. Some fishes called the flying fishes sail through the air with a grasshopper-like motion that closely imitates true flight. Among the insects, the possession of stings is not uncommon. The wasps and bees are familiar examples of stinging insects, but many other kinds less familiar are similarly protected. All insects have their bodies covered with a coat of armor, composed of a horny substance called chitin. In some cases, this chitinous coat is very thick and serves to protect them effectually. This is especially true of the beetles. Some insects are inedible and are conspicuously colored so as to be readily recognized by insectivorous birds. The protection of the young is the source of many adaptive structures as well as of the instincts by which such structures are utilized. In general, those animals are highest in development, with the best means of holding their own in the struggle for life, that take best care of their young. Those instincts which lead to home building are all adaptations for preserving the young. Among the lower or more coarsely organized birds, such as the chicken, the duck, and the auk, as with the reptiles, the young animal is hatched with well-developed muscular system and sense organs, and is capable of running about and, to some extent, of feeding itself. Birds of this type are known as precocial, while the name altricial is applied to the more highly organized forms, such as the thrushes, doves, and songbirds generally. With these the young are hatched in a wholly helpless condition, with ineffective muscles, deficient senses, and dependent wholly upon the parent. The altricial condition demands the building of a nest, the establishment of a home, and the continued care of one or both of the parents. In the marsupials, the kangaroo, opossum, etc., the young are born in a very immature state and are at once seized by the mother and thrust into a pouch or fold of skin along the abdomen, where they are kept until they are able to take care of themselves. This is a singular adaptation, but less specialized and less perfect than the condition found in ordinary mammals. The movements of migratory fishes are mainly controlled by the impulse of reproduction. Many freshwater fishes, as trout and suckers, forsake the large streams in the spring, ascending the small brooks where their young can be reared in greater safety. Still others, known as anadromous fishes, feed and mature in the sea, but ascend the rivers as the impulse of reproduction grows strong. Among such fishes are the salmon, shad, alewife, sturgeon, and striped bass in American waters. Catadromous fishes, as the true eel, reverse this order, feeding in the rivers and brackish estuaries, apparently finding their usual spawning ground in the sea. In questions of attack and defense, the need of fighting animals of their own kind, as well as animals of other races, must be considered. To struggles of species with those of their own kind, the term rivalry may be applied. Actual warfare is confined mainly to males in the breeding season, especially in polygamous species. Among those in which the male mates with many females, he must struggle with other males for their possession. The most notable adaptation is seen in the superior size of teeth, horns, mane, or spurs. In the family of deer, buffalo, and domestic sheep and cattle, the male is larger and more powerfully armed than the female. A large part of the life of the animal is a struggle with the environment itself. In this struggle, only those that are adapted live and leave descendants fitted like themselves. The fur of mammals fits them to their surroundings. As the fur differs, so may the habits change. Some animals are active in winter. Others, as the bear, and in northern Japan the red-faced monkey, hibernate, sleeping in caves or hollow trees, or in burrows until conditions are favorable for their activity. Most snakes and lizards hibernate in cold weather. Some animals in hibernation may be frozen alive without apparent injury. As animals resist heat and cold by adaptations of structure and habits, so may they resist dryness. Certain fishes hold reservoirs of water above their gills, by means of which they can breathe during short excursions from the water. Another series of adaptations is concerned with the places chosen by animals for their homes. The fishes that live in the water have special organs for breathing underwater. The hooked claws of the bat hold on to rocks, the bricks of chimneys, or to the surface of hollow trees, where the bat sleeps through the day. The tree frogs or tree toads have the tips of the toes swollen, forming little pads by which they cling to the bark of trees. Among other adaptations relating to special surroundings or conditions of life are the great cheek pouches of the pocket gophers, which carry off the soil dug up by the large shovel-like feet when the gopher excavates its burrow. Insects that live in water either come up to the surface to breathe or take down air underneath their wings, or in some other way, or have gills for breathing the air which is mixed with the water. Many fishes, chiefly of the deep seas, develop organs for producing light. These are known as luminous organs, phosphorescent organs, or photophores. While among the higher or vertebrate animals, especially the fishes and reptiles, most remarkable cases of adaptation occur, yet the structural changes are for the most part external, usually not affecting fundamentally the development of the internal organs other than the skeleton. The organization of these higher animals is much less plastic than that of the invertebrates. In general, the higher the type, the more persistent and unchangeable are those structures not immediately exposed to the influence of the struggle for existence. It is thus the outside of an animal that tells where its ancestors have lived. The inside, suffering little change whatever the surroundings, tells the real nature of the animal. A special kind of adaptation is shown by animals which are parasitic. These animals attach themselves to the body of their prey or burrow into it, are carried about by it, and live upon it. Some parasites are adapted to an external parasitic life, such as bird lice, fleas, ticks, etc. Others are adapted to an internal parasitic life, as is the case in the tapeworm and trichina. In nearly all cases, the structure of the parasite is very simple, much simpler than that of other animals which live free, active lives. This simplicity, however, is not primitive, but results from the degeneration of structures rendered useless by the habit of life. Thus, a fixed and permanent parasite possesses no locomotor organs, no special sense organs, no highly developed nervous system, no alimentary system, and but a very simple circulatory and respiratory system. Lancaster has well expressed the effects of the parasitic habit of life. Let the parasitic life once be secured, and away go legs, jaws, eyes, and ears. The active, highly gifted crab, insect, or annelid may become a mere sac, absorbing nourishment and laying eggs. This simplicity of structure in parasitic animals does not, however, indicate that they belong to animals low in the scale of animal life. It is rather the result of a mode of life. This is shown by the fact that many parasites in their young stages are free, active animals, very much more complex in structure than they are in adult life. Lancaster's comparison of the life history of the parasites Sacculina and Lerniocera with that of an active shrimp will illustrate this point. Diagrams are given showing the advancing complexity of structure in the shrimp Peneus. Compare these with the young stages of a number of shrimp-like animals, that is, Sacculina, Lerniocera, Lepas, Cyclops, Limnetis, some of which lead a parasitic life. The eggs of all develop equally into the recapitulative phase known as the nauplius, but while the nauplius of the free-living shrimp grows more and more elaborate, observe what happens to the parasites. They degenerate into comparatively simple bodies, and this is true of their internal structure as well as of their external appearance. The most utterly reduced of these parasites is the curious Sacculina, which infests hermit crabs and is a mere sac filled with eggs, and absorbing nourishment from the juices of its host by root-like processes. Lerniocera, again, which in the adult condition is found attached to the gills of fishes, has lost the well-developed legs of its nauplius childhood and become an elongated worm-like creature fitted only to suck in nourishment and carry eggs. In this same group, the life history of the barnacle illustrates a similar degeneration not due to parasitism. This again Lancaster describes. Among these pictured nauplii, all belonging to the great group Crustacea, which includes crabs and shrimps, is one which gives rise to an animal decidedly degenerate, but not precisely parasitic in its habits. The egg of the barnacle gives rise to an actively swimming nauplius, the history of which is very astonishing. After swimming about for a time, the barnacle's nauplius fixes its head against a piece of wood and takes to a perfectly fixed, immobile state of life. Its organs of touch and of sight atrophy, its legs lose their locomotor function and are simply used for bringing floating particles to the orifice of the stomach, so that an eminent naturalist has compared one of these animals to a man standing on his head and kicking his food into his mouth. Were it not for the recapitulative phases in the development of the barnacle, we may doubt whether naturalists would ever have guessed that it was a degenerate crustacean. It was, in fact, for a long time regarded as quite remote from them and placed among the snails and oysters. Its true nature was only admitted when the young form was discovered. Very many other organisms among both plants and animals showing varying degrees of degenerative adaptation might be cited. It should be noted in this connection that degeneration in biology means an evolutionary method of adaptation by means of which plants and animals are adjusted to special environmental conditions. It does not mean weakness, decline, defects, and decay in structural and physiological conditions similar to those occurring in human life. There is only a far-fetched analogous resemblance between human degeneration in the usual sense and degeneration in biology, which may be called adaptive, because as a result of such degeneration, organisms are better fitted for life under special conditions. In fact, many naturalists believe that natural selection has often preserved those individuals which because of certain degenerations are better fitted to their life conditions. Hence, adaptive degeneration in biology is a form of evolution, and it is a highly significant fact that some species of animals and plants have been fitted to their special environment by adaptive degeneration. It should be noted in passing that in animals and plants there is non-adaptive and destructive degeneration that is parallel to degeneration in human life. The effects of disease in weakening and ultimately destroying animals and plants is an example. In all such cases there is no advantage gained, which is exactly the case in the physiological, mental, and moral degeneration commonly referred to in human life. Obviously, adaptive degeneration has occurred in human life, for the human body has dozens of structures like the appendix, which have been adapted by a degenerative process. Some of the most important special plant adaptations are along these lines: nutritive adaptations, adaptations for protection against animals, adaptations for pollination, adaptations for the dispersal of fruits and seeds, and color adaptations for attracting animals. Of the nutritive adaptations, the parasitic habit of life in plants which draw their food supply wholly or partially from another plant or animal, called the host, should be mentioned. The dodder shows an adaptation of this kind. It lives on the stems of other plants, and instead of developing roots and green leaves with which to carry on the processes of food manufacture, it develops no green leaves, but instead a special absorbing organ, the hostoria, which penetrates the tissues of the host plant from which it obtains its nourishment. There are many plants adapted to this parasitic habit of life. Others are semi-parasitic. This is the case with the mistletoe, the false foxgloves, and with some orchids. A curious case of special nutritive adaptation is to be found in carnivorous plants. These plants seem to require animal food and have organs variously modified to obtain it. In the common sundew, insects are caught by a sticky secretion which proceeds from hairs on the leaves. When an insect touches one of these sticky hairs, it is caught, and the hairs at once begin to close over it until it is held fast on the leaf. Here it soon dies and then remains for many days, while the leaf pours out a juice by which some parts of the insect are digested. This digested material is then absorbed, while the undigested parts drop off after the hairs let go their hold. Other interesting adaptations for the capture by plants of insects are to be found in the Venus flytrap, the common pitcher plant, and others. Other modifications have been developed as a means of protection from vegetable-feeding creatures. These are chiefly along the lines of the formation of uneatable tissue, as in the horsetails and rushes, the arming of exposed parts with cutting edges, stinging hairs, prickles and thorns, as in grasses, nettles, cactuses, etc., and the accumulation of disagreeable or poisonous substances in exposed parts, as in the tansy, ragweed, boneset, jimsonweed, and poisonous hemlock. One of the acacias, Acacia spherocephala, has an interesting adaptation to attract ant-dwellers as a protection from insects and other creatures. At the bases of the leaves there are developed large hollow stipules, and at the ends of the leaflets are nectaries. The ants bore holes in the stipules, live in them, find food in the nectaries, and offer valuable protection to the plant in warding off its enemies. A large number of plants offer inducements of many sorts to attract ant visitors. The special adaptations for the dispersal of seeds offer an equally interesting field for study. It is obviously of advantage to the plant that its seeds be disseminated as widely as possible. Sometimes the seeds themselves are modified for dispersal, sometimes the fruit in which they are enclosed, and often it is a larger part of the plant. This is the case with the common tumbleweed, a profusely branching plant bearing many seeds which in the fall is torn from its anchorage by the wind and rolled about, scattering its seeds for great distances. Some fruits which are distributed by the wind are provided with wings, as in the maple, elm, ash, etc., while others bear plumes and feathery tufts to enable them to float in the air, as in the dandelions, thistles, and others. Not infrequently the adaptation for seed dispersal is in the mechanical discharge provided for in the structure of the seed case. In such plants as the witch hazel, violet, wild balsam, and others, the dry fruits burst with explosive force, throwing the seeds some distance away from the parent plant. When the adaptations are related to dispersal by means of animals, they take the form of grappling appendages, as in the beggar ticks, sticktights, burdocks, cockleburs, etc., of hard seeds capable of passing through the digestive tract unharmed, or of attractive and brightly colored fruits whose seeds are undesirable or indigestible. Good examples of conspicuously colored fruits whose seeds are scattered in this way are cherries, raspberries, blackberries, etc. End of section 26. Section 27 of The Science History of the Universe, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Availle in February 2017. The Science History of the Universe, Volume 5. Edited by Francis Rolt-Wheeler. Biology. Chapter 16, Adaptation, Part 2. It will be noted that the color adaptations of plants referred to so far are supposed to relate plants to animals. But aside from these, there are many general and special adaptations in coloring substances, green, yellow, and red, which have a physiological value in plant life. These, however, are special problems of botany and cannot be referred to here. The whole question of color adaptations in plants has in recent years come up for rediscussion. This discussion cannot be given here, but a good idea of the points at issue can be gathered from the perusal of an essay entitled The Significance of Color by Professor D.T. McDougall of the Carnegie Institute. In discussing the color adaptations of animals, it is convenient to group them in the following classes: protective and aggressive resemblances, warning coloration, mimicry, and colors displayed in courtship. The color pattern of animals is often such as to effectually conceal them in their surroundings. Thus, tree-dwelling animals are often green in color, as is the case with the tree frog. Desert dwellers are often a mottled gray, while Arctic dwellers are a snowy white. Far more striking, however, than these cases of general color adaptation are those cases of special adaptation in which the animal resembles in color and shape some particular part of its usual environment. Professors Jordan and Kellogg in Animal Life give some good example of special color adaptation. Among them are the following. The larvae of the geometrid moths, called inchworms or spanworms, are twig-like in appearance and have the habit, when disturbed, of standing out stiffly from the twig or branch upon which they rest, so as to resemble in position as well as in color and markings a short or a broken twig. One of the most striking resemblances of this sort is shown by a large geometrid larva found near Ithaca, New York. The body of this caterpillar has a few small irregular spots or humps, resembling very exactly the scars left by fallen buds or twigs. These caterpillars have a special muscular development to enable them to hold themselves rigidly for long times in this trying attitude. They also lack the middle prop legs of the body, common to other Lepidopterous larvae, the presence of which would tend to destroy the illusion so successfully carried out by them. The common walking stick, with its wingless, greatly elongate, dull-colored body, is an excellent example of special protective resemblance. It is quite indistinguishable, when at rest, from the twigs to which it is clinging. Another member of the family of insects to which the walking stick belongs is the famous green-leaf insect. It is found in South America and is of a bright green color, with broad leaf-like wings and body, with markings which imitate the leaf veins and small irregular yellowish spots which mimic decaying or stained or fungus-covered spots in the leaf. There are many butterflies that resemble dead leaves. But most remarkable of all is a large butterfly, Kalima, of the East Indian region. The upper sides of the wings are dark, with purplish and orange markings, not at all resembling a dead leaf. But the butterflies, when at rest, hold their wings together over the back, so that only the undersides of the wings are exposed. The undersides of Kalima's wings are exactly the color of a dead and dried leaf, and the wings are so held that all combine to mimic with extraordinary fidelity a dead leaf still attached to the twig by a short pedicle or leaf stalk, imitated by a short tail on the hind wings, and showing midrib, oblique veins, and, most remarkable of all, two apparent holes, like those made in leaves by insects, but in the butterfly imitated by two small circular spots free from scales and hence clear and transparent. With the head and feelers concealed beneath the wings, it makes the resemblance wonderfully exact. In all cases of this kind, the animals are said to be protectively colored. Special color resemblance sometimes does more than conceal an animal from its enemies. It often assists it to catch its prey. Some animals are said to be aggressively colored, or to have aggressive resemblance. The colors of snakes, lizards, and frogs are doubtless both protective and aggressive, while those of the polar bear, the Arctic fox, the weasel, the wolf, the lion, and the tiger are purely aggressive. Poulton, in The Colors of Animals, cites some examples of a still more remarkable use of color resemblance. He says, "Special aggressive resemblance sometimes does more than hide an animal from its prey. It may even attract the latter by simulating the appearance of some object which is of special interest or value to it. Such appearances have been called alluring coloration by Wallace, and they are some of the most interesting of all forms of aggressive resemblance. An Asiatic lizard, Phrynocephalus mystaceus, is a good example. Its general surface resembles the sand on which it is found, while the fold of skin at each angle of the mouth is of a red color and is produced into a flower-like shape exactly resembling a little red flower which grows in the sand. Insects, attracted by what they believe to be flowers, approach the mouth of the lizard and are of course captured. The angler or fishing frog possesses a lure in shape of long, slender filaments, the foremost and longest of which has a flattened and divided extremity. The fish stirs up the mud so as to conceal itself and waves these filaments about. Small fish are attracted by the lure, mistaking it for worms writhing about in the muddy waters. They approach and are instantly engulfed in the enormous mouth of the angler. An Indian mantis, Hymenopus bicornis, feeds upon other insects which it attracts by its flower-like shape and pink color. The apparent petals are the flattened legs of the insect. While many animals are very inconspicuously colored, or are manifestly colored so as to resemble their surroundings, generally or specifically, many other animals are very brightly and conspicuously colored and patterned. They possess warning coloration. A very common example of an animal with warning colors, says Poulton, is afforded by the larva of the currant moth or magpie moth, which is extremely abundant in gardens. The caterpillar is extremely conspicuous, being of a cream color with orange and black markings. Although it belongs to the group of well-concealed stick caterpillars, it makes no attempt to hold itself in any of the attitudes characteristic of its group. All observers agree that birds, lizards, frogs, and spiders either refuse these species altogether or exhibit signs of the most intense disgust after tasting it. The caterpillar of the buff-tip moth and the cinnabar moth are also extremely abundant and are good examples of the association of warning colors with a nauseous taste. Both of them are gregarious, living in large companies, so that their conspicuous appearance is greatly intensified. The colors of the first named larva are black, yellow, and orange. It feeds on oak, elm, lime, birch, hazel, etc., and the large bare branches which attest its appetite are very familiar sights in autumn. The second caterpillar is colored by alternate black and yellow rings. It feeds upon ragwort in the summer. There is plenty of experimental evidence for the unpleasant taste of both caterpillars. The conspicuously black and yellow banded larva of the common monarch butterfly is a good example of the possession of warning colors by distasteful caterpillars. These warning colors are possessed not only by the ill-tasting caterpillars, but by many animals which have special means of defense. The wasps and bees, provided with stings, dangerous animals to trouble, are almost all conspicuously marked with yellow and black. The ladybird beetles, composing a whole family of small beetles which are all ill-tasting, are brightly and conspicuously colored and spotted. The Gila monster, the only poisonous lizard, differs from most other lizards in being strikingly patterned with black and brown. Some of the venomous snakes are conspicuously colored, as the coral snakes or coralillos of the tropics. All these animals with warning colors are described as possessing some quality, a disagreeable taste or odor, stings, hair, etc., causing them to be obnoxious to other animals that might seize them for food. Poulton says, "The object of warning colors is to assist the education of enemies, enabling them to easily learn and remember the animals which are to be avoided." Another special kind of color adaptation to be included under warning coloration is known under the head of recognition markings. Instead of attracting the attention of enemies, these markings are of use in attracting the attention of individuals of the same species. To this category belong the white upturned tail of the rabbit, the black tip of the weasel's tail, and many of the bright feathers in wings and tail display by birds in flight. Certain animals which are without special means of defense and are not at all formidable or dangerous are yet so marked or shaped and so behave as to present a threatening or terrifying appearance. The large green caterpillars of the sphinx moths, the tomato worm is a familiar one of these larvae, have a formidable-looking, sharp horn on the back of the next to last body ring. When disturbed, they lift the hinder part of the body, bearing the horn, and move it about threateningly. As a matter of fact, the horn is not at all a weapon of defense, but is quite harmless. The larvae of the puss moth has been often referred to as a striking example of terrifying appearances. When one of these larvae is disturbed, it retracts its head into the first body ring, inflating the margin, which is of bright red color. There are two intensely black spots on this margin in the appropriate position for eyes, and the whole appearance is that of a large flat face extending to the outer edge of the red margin. The effect is an intensely exaggerated caricature of a vertebrate face, which is probably alarming to the vertebrate enemies of the caterpillar. The effect is greatly strengthened by two pink whips, which are swiftly protruded from the prongs of the fork in which the body terminates. The end of the body is at the same time curved toward over the back, so that the pink filaments are brandished above the head. Some of the instances of protective resemblance, warning coloration, and terrifying attitudes that have been given are sufficiently remarkable, but the phenomena of mimicry are even more surprising. The term mimicry has been reserved for those cases in which an otherwise defenseless animal, one without poison, fang, or sting, and without an ill-tasting substance in its body, mimics some other specially defended or inedible animal sufficiently to be taken for it and so escape attack. These instances are especially to be observed among insects. The most familiar example, perhaps, is that of the viceroy butterfly, which mimics the monarch. The bees and wasps are protected by their stings. They are usually conspicuous, being banded with yellow and black. They are mimicked by numerous other insects, especially moths and flies, two defenseless kinds of insects. This mimicking of bees and wasps by flies is very common and can be observed readily at any flowering shrub. The flower flies, Syrphidae, which, with the bees, visit flowers, can be distinguished from the bees only by sharp observing. When these bees and flies can be caught and examined in hand, it will be found that the flies have but 2 wings, while the bees have 4. In addition to the colors and patterns which assist an animal to evade or warn off its enemies, or to secure its prey, there are also colors and appendages which must have some very different meaning. These appearances are seen in mature animals and frequently undergo periodical development at times which correspond to the breeding season, and when the 2 sexes differ, the males are almost invariably the more brilliant. Instances in which the colors of the males exceed those of the females in brilliancy or pattern are many among fishes, lizards, birds, spiders, insects, etc. It is most common among insects and birds. Many of these sexual differences were described in the chapter on sexual selection. However these colors may have arisen, every observer must admit that they are in some way connected with sex. Darwin accounted for them by his celebrated theory of sexual selection. He supposed that the aesthetic sense is widely distributed among the higher animals, vertebrates and some of the most specialized invertebrates, and that the colors, which certainly appeal to this sense in man, are not without effect in causing gratification to the animals themselves. This explanation of the origin and meaning of sexual coloring is not accepted by Mr. Wallace, whose chief objection is the lack of evidence that the female has any aesthetic preferences at all in the selection of her mate. Concerning the whole question of the adaptations of plants and animals, there is much question today. It is thought by many that the strength of the natural selection explanation rests on the logical nature of its premises and conclusions rather than on scientific observation and experiment. By others it is thought to be the best explanation so far advanced. Professor Kellogg comments on the present status of the theory in its relation to adaptation as follows. There is no gainsaying to the selection explanation, its claim to stand among all proposed explanations of adaptation as that one least shaken by the critical attack of its adversaries. However mightily the scientific imagination must exert itself to deliver certain difficult cases into the hands of selection, and however sophisticated and lawyer-like the argument from the selection side may be for any single refractory example, the fact remains that the selectionist seems to be able to stretch his explanation to fit all adaptations, with less danger of finding it brought up against positive adverse facts than is possible to the champion of any other so far proposed explanation. So comprehensive is the doctrine of evolution that it has been described as one of the greatest acquisitions of human knowledge. Professor Losey writes of it, "There has been no point of intellectual vantage reached which is more inspiring. It is so comprehensive that it enters into all realms of thought." Weismann expresses the opinion that the theory of descent is the most progressive step that has been taken in the development of human knowledge. And further he says that this opinion is justified even by this fact alone, that the evolution idea is not merely a new light on the special regions of biological sciences, zoology, and botany, but is of quite general importance. The conception of an evolution of life upon the earth reaches far beyond the bounds of any single science, and influences our whole realm of thought. It means nothing less than the elimination of the miraculous from our knowledge of nature, and the placing of the phenomena of life on the same plane as the other natural processes, that is, as having been brought about by the same forces and being subject to the same laws. Already the field of evolution is being still further extended by new problems in human evolution. The evidences in reference to the evolution of the human body are so conclusive that it is generally accepted that the natural continuity of life includes the human species, and students are turning their attention to the problem of the evolution of mentality. In Professor Losey's words, "The progressive intelligence of animals is shown to depend upon the structure of the brain and the nervous system, and there exists such a finely graded series in this respect that there is strong evidence of the derivation of human faculties from brute faculties." The conception of evolution is no new idea. It is the human idea of history grown larger, large enough to cover the whole world. The extension of the idea was gradual as men felt the need of extending it, and at the same moment we find men believing in the external preeminence of one set of phenomena, in the creation of others, in the evolution of others. One authority says human institutions have been evolved, man was created, the heavens are eternal. According to another, matter and motion are eternal, life was created, the rest has been evolved, except perhaps the evolution theory, which was created by Darwin. Of the wise men of Greece and what they thought of the nature and origin of things, little will be said. Most of them were philosophers, not naturalists, and we are apt to read our own ideas into their words. They thought indeed about the physical and organic universe, and some of them believed it to be, as we do, the result of a process. But here in most cases ends the resemblance between their thought and that of modern students. Thus, when Anaximander spoke of a fish-like stage in the past history of man, this was no prophecy of the modern idea that a fish-like form was one of the far-off ancestors of backboned animals. It was only a fancy invented to get over a difficulty connected with the infancy of the first human being. Or, when several of these sages reduced the world to one element, the ether, it is doing the progress of knowledge an injustice to say that men are simply returning to this after more than 2,000 years. For that conception of the ether which is characteristic of modern physical science has been, or is being, slowly attained by precise and patient analysis, whereas the ancient conception was reached by metaphysical speculation. If a return is being made to the Greeks, it is on a higher turn of the spiral, so far at least as the ether is concerned. When Empedocles sought to explain the world as the result of two principles, love and hate, working on the four elements, one may, if so inclined, call these principles attractive and repulsive forces. He may recognize in them the altruistic and individualistic factors in organic evolution and whatnot, but Empedocles was a poetic philosopher, not far-sighted prophet of evolution. As in other departments of knowledge, so in biology the work of Aristotle is fundamental. It is wonderful to think of his knowledge of forms and ways of life, or the insight with which he foresaw such useful distinctions as that between analogous and homologous organs, or his recognition of the fact of correlation, of the advantages of division of labor within organisms, of the gradual differentiation observed in development. He planted seeds which grew after long sleep into comparative anatomy and classification. Yet with what sublime humility he says, "I found no basis prepared, no models to copy. Mine is the first step, and therefore a small one, though worked out with much thought and hard labor." Aristotle was not an evolutionist, for although he recognized the changefulness of life, the world was to him an eternal fact, not a stage in a process. In nature, the passage for inanimate things to animals is so gradual that it is impossible to draw a hard and fast line between them. After inanimate things come plants, which differ from one another in the degree of life which they possess. Compared with inert bodies, plants seem endowed with life, Compared with animals, they seem inanimate. From plants to animals, the passage is by no means sudden or abrupt. One finds living things in the sea about which there is doubt whether they be animals or plants. Among the Romans, Lucretius gave noble expression to the philosophy of Epicurus. He was a cosmic, but hardly an organic evolutionist, for according to his poetic fancy, organisms arose from the earth's fertile bosom and not by the gradual transformation of simpler predecessors. In the first place, the first breed of lions and the savage races their courage has protected, foxes their craft, and stags their proneness to flight. But light sleeping dogs with faithful hearts in breast, and every kind which is born of the seed of beasts of burden, and at the same time the woolly flocks and the horned herds, are all consigned to the protection of man. For they have ever fled with eagerness from wild beasts, and have ensued peace, and plenty of food obtained without their own labor, as we give it in requital of their useful services. But those to whom nature has granted none of these qualities, so that they could neither live by their own means nor perform for us any useful service, in return for which we should suffer their kind to feed and be safe under our protection, those, you are to know, would lie exposed as a prey and booty of others, hampered all in their own death-bringing shackles, until nature brought that kind to utter destruction. From Lucretius to Buffon, the intervening centuries were uneventful as regards zoology. Hugo Spitzer, one of the historians of evolution, finds analogies between certain medieval scholastics and the Darwinians of the 19th century, but these are subtle comparisons. Yet, long before Darwin's day, there were evolutionists, and the first of these who can be called great was Buffon. One must guard against supposing that the works of Buffon or Lamarck or Darwin were inexplicable creations of genius, or that they came like cataclysms, without warning, to shatter the conventional traditions of their time. For all great workers have their forerunners who prepare their paths. Therefore, in thinking out the history of evolutionist theories before that of Buffon, account must be taken of many forces which began to be influential from the 12th century onward. Evolution in social affairs has not only suggested our ideas of evolution in the other sciences, but has deeply colored them in accordance with the particular phase of social evolution current at the time. The evolution of theories of evolution is bound up with the whole progress of the world. Among the evolutionists before Darwin, only 3 need be noted: Buffon, Erasmus Darwin, and Lamarck. Buffon, 1707 to 1788, was born to wealth and was wedded to fortune. As director of the Jardin du Roi, he had opportunity to acquire a wide knowledge of animals. He commanded the assistance of able collaborators, and his own industry was untiring. He was about 40 years old when he began his great natural history, and he worked till he was 80. He lived a full life, the success of which we can almost read in the strong confidence of his style. Erasmus Darwin, 1731 to 1802, grandfather to the author of The Origin of Species, was a large-hearted, thoughtful physician, whose life was as full of pleasant eccentricities as his stammering speech of wit and his books of wisdom. Buffon underrated the transforming influence of action and laid emphasis upon the direct influence of surroundings. Erasmus Darwin emphasized function and regarded the influence of the environment as for the most part indirect. On Lamarck, 1744 to 1829, success did not shine as it did on the Comte de Buffon or on Dr. Erasmus Darwin. His life was often so hard that it is wonder he did not say more about the struggle for existence. Of Lamarck's Philosophie zoologique, Haeckel says, "This admirable work is the first connected and thoroughly logical exposition of the theory of descent." And again he says, to Lamarck will remain the immortal glory of having for the first time established the theory of descent as an independent scientific generalization of the first order, as the foundation of the whole of biology. The condition of evolution is variability, or the tendency which animals have to change. The primary factors of evolution are those which produce variations, which cause organic inequilibrium. There are evidently three direct ways in which these organic changes may be reproduced. 1. From the nature of the organism itself, that is, from constitutional or germinal peculiarities which are ultimately traceable to influences from without. 2. From changes in its functions or activity, in other words, from use and disuse, or 3. From the direct influence of the external conditions of life, food, temperature, moisture, etc. It is with such problems as these that modern research into the causes of the descent of species is concerned. But of these today, scientists are forced to confess almost complete ignorance. As for the future, the keynote of work is to examine life at closer range and from new points of view, to observe life phenomena with a keener and more critical eye, to evolve new methods of work, to experiment more extensively, more intensively, and more critically, to classify, to organize, and to deduce. And with patient, careful, and long-continued effort, who will say that even these mysteries may not yield up their secrets for the benefit of mankind? End of section 27. End of The Science History of the Universe, Volume 5, Biology, edited by Francis Rolt-Wheeler.